Hey everyone, if you're enjoying my RM audiobooks, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that hype, and maybe check out my Patreon if you want to support the channel even more. Your support means a lot and helps me keep these coming. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Dust and Echoes. Chapter 35, Origin of Fables. My God, someone muttered under their breath as they saw the universe at its inception. Ashbin didn't know who said it, but he supposed it didn't matter. They were all thinking the same thing, including himself. More than anything else, Ashbin dryly noted, having gone through this process several times before, Jin is a storyteller. The universe continued to grow around them. Stars blinked into light, swirling into massive cloud-like galaxies that stretched as far as the eye could see. Jin could no longer be seen. Having disappeared into the story she was weaving before their very eyes. Her presence could still be felt, however, and if he focused he could just barely make out her form in the stars like a constellation. The precursors were the first to come into being. Jin's disembodied voice explained as several disparate forms began to soar across the cosmos, and were beyond all other forms of life in the universe. A transcendent species, the precursors were, in effect, living gods. Ashbin watched what he could only assume was a precursor vessel traveling through an empty region of space, and Jin's voice continued. The precursors were dreamers and makers whose minds transcended many realms. They had infinite forms, many voices, and a singular purpose: to spread across the universe and fill it with life. Entire star systems were created under their guiding principle, the mantle of responsibility, a belief that the universe itself was alive on a scale no organic being could possibly fathom. It is through this philosophy that neural physics was born, which they used to manipulate reality as they saw fit. Entire systems were born and seeded, with vast star roads connecting them. As the precursor vessel traveled through the universe, they watched as cosmic energy flowed from it into nearby nebulas. From the strands came stars, planets, and more, rewriting reality right before their very eyes. It reminded Ashbin of the magic he himself wielded, only on a scale unlike anything he had ever seen before. Was this what the precursors were truly capable of? If so, no wonder Jin called them living gods. The ability to create entire star systems and life itself was an act so grandiose, beings like himself could only attribute it to the divine. The precursor ship then came to a stop in an empty region of space, crafting one final solar system. The star was a bright yellow, and soon the cosmic dust and debris left behind began to accumulate into planets. Some were small and rocky, while others were gas giants. A few crashed into others, one such impact creating a massive moon that cooled and began to orbit the burning world below. In time, the planet cooled entirely and started to fill with water. Ashbin didn't know if the stellar forgery occurred over billions of years or in a single afternoon. He supposed it didn't matter, and once the star system was finished, the precursor vessel left to repeat the cycle over and over again. That's the Sol system, Halsey realized, her eyes widening as she watched the cosmic construction of her homeworld play out. The UNSC representatives were in a similar state of shock, and Ashbin had to force himself not to lose himself to his emotions. Only John seemed to be completely controlled, his eyes focusing heavily on what he and the others were seeing, carving the information as deeply into his memories as possible. Jin continued as another precursor vessel entered the ancient Sol system. The precursors were not limited to their original bodies. They assumed any shape they saw fit as they repeatedly allowed themselves to evolve, die, and renew countless times over the eons. Some were quite familiar. Ashbin's eyes widened in recognition as the precursors emerged from their vessel. They were both humanoid in form and bathed in light. One was golden with deer-like antlers on his head. The other was a dark purple and had ram horns in its place. "Are those?" Glinda muttered incredulously, and Ashbin gulped then nodded. "The two brothers," Ashbin confirmed, and they watched as the brothers walked out onto the ancient earth and held out their hands. From them, microscopic life began to flourish, eventually turning multicellular. Algae, plankton, fish, reptiles, and more began to spread across the planet under their careful watch, eventually turning into primitive mammals and apes after several mass extinction events the brothers did nothing to prevent. The brothers seemed to take particular interest in the apes, and as they continued to develop over the course of eons, Ashbin realized he was looking at the forebears of humanity itself. Then another ship arrived, and as it opened its doors to reveal a third precursor, Jin added, others were incomprehensibly alien. "Jesus Christ," Lord Hood muttered as they looked at what could only be described as a monster. Ashbin didn't know how to describe this precursor, only that if the brothers looked peaceful, this precursor looked malevolent. It had multiple arms and tentacles, vaguely reminding Ashbin of a crab as it looked at the two brothers with vibrant red eyes. This precursor felt more primordial than anything else. No words were spoken between them, but Ashbin could understand the tension between both groups all too well. Nothing came of it, however, and the primordial took several large groups of ancient humans onto its ship before departing, the two brothers silently watching throughout the entire process. Jin's story followed the primordial ship as it entered a far-off star system, depositing the collection of humanity onto the new world to evolve in a different direction. In their quest to follow the mantle, the precursors constantly sought to find a worthy successor to their role, to become stewards of all life in the Milky Way galaxy before they moved on to the next. Jin explained as she showed other precursors, each one taking a different form than the ones before, created countless species across the Milky Way galaxy. Most were found wanting, and some of the harsher examples of the precursors proceeded to wipe them out and start anew. Ashbin's eyes widened in horror as he witnessed the primordial craft, one such species, and watched as its civilization grew, spreading across its entire planet. From its perch, its eyes burned with growing disappointment. Then, with a wave of one of its massive arms, its vessel fired upon the world with a bright flash. When the light receded, the once vibrant world lay completely dead, no trace of life left to be uncovered. Without so much as a sigh, the primordial turned around and left to continue its work. In time, Jin continued as the two planets humanity was planted on came into focus, each one slowly starting to glow as civilization spread across their surfaces. Two species of importance were crafted by the precursors, both stemming from common ancestry. Humanity's ancestors, hailing from ancient Earth known to them as Erdatrine, gifted in both body and soul, and the Forerunners, hailing from the verdant paradise of Gibald, gifted in body and mind. Erdatrine came into focus, and the humans watched in silent wonder as their ancestors walked about in their alien yet familiar cities. They weren't all the same, with many disparate species all living together in their vast communities. Homo sapiens, Halsey muttered as she started to point out the different species of human before them. Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, Homo rhodesiensis, Homo neanderthalensis. They're all here. Doctor, please tell me you're recording this, Agent Adler all too calmly asked, and Halsey nodded after performing a quick check. Every last second of it, she answered, much to his and everyone else's relief. Part of Ashbin was honestly worried that Halsey's recording device wouldn't work in Jin's dimension, but it appeared such worries were for naught. The ancestors were divided into different groups and species, constantly fighting both each other and themselves. Jin revealed as the once vibrant city was torn apart by war, with humans of every species killing and dying for unexplained and ultimately unimportant reasons. The all-too-familiar bloodshed made Ashbin sigh regretfully. It appeared that, no matter the time period, mankind seemed doomed to be pitted against itself over petty squabbles. Much to Ashbin's surprise, the ancestors weren't only waging war with guns and blades. They were wielding the same magic he himself had used across his many lifetimes, a power he now found himself comparing to neural physics. Most were only using rudimentary forms of magic, striking down their opponents with balls of fire and spears of stone, while others were just as skilled as he once was as they changed the landscape before them and wove more esoteric spells. A few were even more powerful, using magic on a scale Ashbin had never seen even in his first life. Whenever they were hit, their bodies flashed with energy shields emanating from their armor. As the battles were waged, the shields broke under the strain of combat, only for the following blows to be blocked by what Ashbin recognized as aura. Ammunition ran dry, and the combatants descended into furious melees, even their auras eventually shattering. But instead of their strength disappearing alongside their auras, they kept going, their blows powerful enough to shatter stone and lift weights far heavier than they should have been capable of bearing. They're like Spartans, John dryly noted as he idly glanced down at his own arms. Spartans with aura and magic, gifted in body and soul. Halsey repeated Jin's earlier words. At the exact same time, Ashbin made a similar connection, and he realized the truth. Humanity's ancestors, hailing from prehistoric Earth, had bodies as naturally strong as those augmented by the Spartan program and further gifted with aura and magic. But while Ashbin knew why the people of Remnant had lost their ability to wield magic and only retained a semblance of the power they once held, that didn't explain where their previous strength went, nor why what remained only existed on Remnant. It created a sinking feeling in his gut, and he didn't like it. And yet, Jin continued. For as ready as the ancestors were to destroy themselves, they were just as quick to lay down their arms and rebuild. In time, enemies would become neighbors, even friends as they followed their philosophy of Daomad, the roll and tug of the universe, or the mantra of the broken wheel. Ashbin smiled as the scene transitioned into peace, and the survivors returned to their homes, rebuilding what was destroyed. The burnt city was restored to its former splendor, the disparate species of humanity returning to their previous friendships as the city grew larger and larger. When the cycle repeated, Ashbin frowned, particularly as the violence spread to other planets and even against other alien species, and his earlier thought seemed more vindicated. Occasionally, they'd see various precursors, including the two brothers, watching humanity grow from afar with a dispassionate gaze. As their civilization spread across the stars, humanity collapsed and rebuilt themselves countless times, not unlike their creators, whom they worshipped as their gods. Some even modified themselves, taking on the traits of animals to emulate them even as they continued to fight, squabble, and most importantly of all, adapt to an ever-changing universe. This chaos and adaptation pleased the precursors at large as it embodied their belief in living time, how all aspects of life, both good and evil, enrich the universe at large. Of course, some wished that they wouldn't risk destroying themselves in the process. In time, they grew to become one of the galaxy's preeminent Tier 1 civilizations, bolstered by an alliance with another. "Oh, you gotta kidding me," Lord Hood expressed as they saw a cluster of ancestors shaking hands with said alien allies. While they certainly were far sturdier and healthier than what they had already seen, and somehow beautiful much to Ashbin's confusion, the aliens were recognizably Sanchoum. As the others watched the ancestors and Sanchoum forge and strengthen their alliance, they were silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Crow reached into his jacket, pulled out a flask filled with whiskey, drank some of its contents, then said, "The universe just fucking loves irony, doesn't it?" "Is that a question, Crow?" Jin playfully asked, and the veteran huntsman's eyes bulged. No, it's not," he hastily clarified, much to Jin's amusement. "Please watch what you say, Branwyn. We can't afford to waste the last question," John simply stated as he kept his gaze focused on what was being shown, causing Crow to grumble as he put the flask back into his pocket. Jin's disembodied voice chuckled, and she continued, "But for as powerful as the ancestors and their Sanchoum allies were, they were not the dominant power in the galaxy. That position was held by their interstellar cousins, the Forerunners." Jin's story shifted and returned to Gibbled, where they saw the Forerunners spread their civilization across its surface. They had changed significantly since the last time they saw them. While the Forerunners were still humanoid in overall shape, they were noticeably taller, their bodies slender and covered in patches of fine, purple, pink, or white fur on their heads, shoulders, and back of their hands. Unlike humans, they lacked pronounced noses or ears, instead only having two slitted nostrils and bulbous protrusions in their place. Gibbled's once verdant paradise was slowly replaced by the encroachment of Forerunner civilization, and eventually the entire planet was covered by one gigantic city supported by 12 colonized star systems nearby. Scenes of their society played out before their very eyes, and Ashbin recognized the distinct formation of different castes known as rates, each one marked by a different mutation that the Forerunners seemed to inflict upon themselves to better serve their assigned tasks. Jin took the time to describe each of them, her voice seemingly fading to the background as she did so. The largest of them were warrior servants, wielding terrifying weapons and backed up by thousands of autonomous drones that darkened the skies under their sheer numbers. It was they who were dominant in this early society, directing all the other castes. Others were miners, tearing apart lifeless worlds to gather the resources needed for their civilization. Life workers tended to the sick and studied the life forms they cataloged. Juridicals investigated crimes. The builders took what the miners gathered to construct their technology, and more. Much to Ashbin's dismay, they saw Gibbled accidentally be rendered lifeless as the Forerunners attempted to master stellar engineering much like their creators, bathing the entire star system in radiation from 12 nearby supernovae as the Precursors watched from above. Like humanity, the Forerunners were created by the Precursors as a potential successor to inherit the mantle of responsibility, Jin revealed. In fact, they were tested first for this role and served alongside the Precursors as their assistants and adjutants. They watched as both Precursor and Forerunner ships traveled across the Milky Way galaxy, seeding and safeguarding life wherever they went. It brought a smile to Ashbin's face, but it quickly fell as Jin continued. But although the Forerunners took to this duty enthusiastically, they were eventually judged by their creators to be unworthy of holding the mantle as they were far too rigid and controlling. Instead, the Precursors chose humanity and its inherent chaos to be tested next for this role, to inherit the mantle instead of the Forerunners. Ashbin and the others watched as the two brothers, along with countless other Precursors, prepared to induct humanity into their role. At the same time, they saw the primordial and those like it ominously preparing as well. What for went unsaid, but the hairs on the back of Ashbin's neck rose regardless. When the Forerunners discovered the Precursors' plan for themselves and humanity, they grew both fearful and enraged. Jin declared as they saw a collection of Forerunners, each one sporting different mutations that marked them as different castes looking over a collection of data. The largest of them appeared to be a warrior servant, and all the others seemed to be following his lead. Jin continued, believing that it was their right to hold the mantle, not humanity's, and fearing that the Precursors were going to wipe them out like they had done to countless creations before. The Forerunners did the one thing the Precursors, in all their vast power, knowledge, and wisdom, never expected. They struck first. Ashbin and the others watched in undisguised horror as a massive Forerunner fleet, the largest any of them had ever seen, emerged out of slipspace where the Precursors had been gathering. The fleet fired their weapons, destroying many Precursor vessels before they had time to react. Soon their victims returned fire, and the entire star system was ablaze as planets were torn apart and shattered. Although the Precursors were older and far more advanced than the Forerunners ever were, they did not fully comprehend what was happening to them. Jin explained as similar scenes played out across the Milky Way galaxy. They had allowed themselves to die countless times before, and initially believed this was yet the next phase of their existence, their momentary pain adding everlasting sweetness to the universe. Beyond token resistance, they did not fight back against the Forerunners, and some even welcomed the novel experience. But by the time the Precursors realized the true extent and goal of the Forerunners' uprising, it was too late. Jin sadly said as they watched the Precursors, the once mighty beings, get ruthlessly slaughtered by the seemingly endless Forerunner fleets and armies. Their bodies were reduced to ash, shot in the back with weapons firing hard light projectiles. None were spared as the Forerunners committed what could only be described as genocide, a sight that made even the stoic Master Chief lower his arms in shock. Gods above, Theodore muttered as the slaughter continued, spreading from world to world as the Precursors, now understanding the threat facing them, valiantly tried to fight back. But they had lost too many, and most simply tried to flee. Desperate to survive, the Precursors tried everything to escape. Jin somberly told them as they watched countless Precursor vessels fly away from the Milky Way galaxy, one of which contained the brothers and another the primordial. They first fled to the large Magellanic Cloud, then known as Path Chthona, but were followed by the Forerunners. Most were slaughtered, and the survivors were driven further into desperation. Scenes of surviving Precursor ships played out before their eyes, and Ashbin watched as the two brothers' ship disappeared from reality entirely. When they emerged, they found themselves before the largest tree Ashbin had ever seen, and despite having never seen it before in his life, the landscape surrounding it felt somewhat familiar. A faint sound echoed across the landscape, sounding like a hammer striking metal, and the two brothers transformed into a deer and ram before disappearing into the colorful brush. Jin continued. Some simply fled beyond the reaches of the galaxy, returning from whence they came, while a few managed to find a way into alternate realities and started anew. Others buried themselves deep underground in isolated planets, while others still reduced themselves to simple powder in the hopes that, in time, they would reform themselves and start again. Eventually, the only traces of the Precursors' existence in the galaxy were the creations they left behind. Not all Forerunners agreed with this act of genocide against their creators. Jin clarified as scenes of intense argument were shown erupting among the Forerunners. When the dissidents were subsequently executed and stranded, Jin added, but they were overruled. A disgusted Crow took another swig of his flask before handing it over to Ironwood, who immediately downed some of the liquor, his eyes never leaving the scene playing out as the Forerunners trapped the dissidents in a planet whose ecosystem was comprised entirely of Forerunner DNA. The plants, animals, every living being on that world was Forerunner, and their exiled brethren were stranded and reduced to a primitive hunter-gatherer state as the others departed. Briefly, Ashbin glanced down at an absolutely terrified Spring, who was cowering behind Glinda while trying to shield her eyes, yet unable to look away. It was only then that Ashbin realized that she, of all people, shouldn't be there watching this horror. But it was too late to do anything about it now, and with a heavy sigh he added the mistake to his ever-increasing pile. With their terrible work complete, many of the Forerunners who participated in the war exiled themselves out of shame and disgust. Only a fraction of their mighty fleet returned to the Milky Way, and the truth behind their ascension was buried. The Forerunners had claimed the mantle of responsibility for themselves, and over the next 10 million years set about to enforce it across their domain. Ashbin and the others watched as Forerunner fleets traveled from world to world, encountering countless species that quickly fell under their rule. One such scene played out in an alien city, filled with beings Ashbin didn't recognize. Initially, the city looked similar to one found on Earth during its early stage of industrialization, with black smoke choking the air. Then the Forerunners and their massive ships arrived, and soon the city was clean and healthy. Aliens walked through the streets and rode on animals, conversing with one another as scores of sentinels patrolled overhead. But rather than feel satisfied at this change, Ashbin once again felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, particularly as he noticed the aliens regarding the sentinels with barely disguised fear. Jin began to explain. Under the watchful eye of the Forerunner Ecumene, life in the Milky Way galaxy flourished and prospered. But unlike the Precursors or the Ancestors, the Forerunners were not content in letting life continue unfettered. They desired to mold reality in their image much as their creators once did. They believed themselves to be above the natural laws of the universe, to be life's shepherds and custodians from all that would threaten it. If reality dared to disagree, they would force reality to bend to their whims, and if life tried to exist without their stewardship, it would suffer the consequences. Ashbin's jaw dropped, and his arms slackened as the alien city was now ablaze. Alien fighters, wielding captured Forerunner weapons, were cheering victoriously atop a destroyed Enforcer Sentinel. Countless bodies of destroyed Sentinels and dead warriors, both Forerunner and alien, lined the streets. Entire buildings were reduced to rubble and ablaze, with black smoke filling the air and raining down embers, but the aliens didn't seem to care about that. Instead, they were cheering as their planet was liberated from what they were denouncing as Forerunner oppression, allowing them to be free to choose their own destinies. Then the sky darkened as a massive Forerunner construct emerged, one large enough and close enough to the planet to block out its sun. Whenever a lesser species rebelled against their rule, the Forerunners would use their guardian custodes to enforce their peace. Jin explained as the guardian was joined by 6 others, who all circled around the planet. Should such a race prove to be too troublesome, they were deemed threats to the mantle itself and pacified permanently. One by one, the guardians began to glow, then they fired their weapons into the alien planet. Within a few moments, the crust cracked and magma seeped into the surface, consuming everything. But they didn't stop there, as the guardians' weapons drilled deeper and deeper into the planet, eventually striking its core. Soon, the core completely collapsed, and the planet itself exploded. Ashbin and the others were speechless. Glinda was covering her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide and unblinking. Ironwood, Theodore, Hood, Halsey, and Adler were simply staring slack-jawed, while Spring was openly crying. Crow and Halsey were overtly enraged, the veteran huntsman practically snarling as the Guardians departed, allowing builder fleets to arrive and strip the ruined planet completely of its resources to be used for their own construction. Only the Master Chief looked unaffected at first glance, but when Ashbin looked closer at the Spartan, he could see that his face was tenser than before, and his fists were so tightly clenched that their already pale skin was even whiter. Of course, these are the beings the Covenant worship as gods, Theodore quietly dismissed, speaking for all of them. Jin continued as the Milky Way galaxy was displayed, with most of it glowing blue to show the Forerunners' empire, while much of the Orion arm glowed yellow. The Ancestors and their Sanchoam allies were among the only species capable of resisting the Ecumene's encroachment. They expanded their reach away from the Forerunners along the Orion arm, towards the outer edge of the galaxy. Occasionally, they would clash along their borders, and tensions were always high as both the Ancestors and the Forerunners laid claim as inheritors of the mantle. But large-scale conflict was mostly avoided. Jin's voice suddenly grew fearful as she added, "But humanity, in their endless drive to explore the unknown, eventually unearthed something that should have been left buried." Human and Sanchoam star systems started turning red one by one. At first it was only a trickle, but soon entire clusters were turning red as something unseen started to spread. Ashbin looked around to find Jin's constellation, and he could just barely make out the terrified look on her face as she continued. The Ancestors from their capital at Charmhacker, along with their Sanchoam allies, waged their battle against the disease consuming their entire civilization. But as armies and fleets fell to the parasite, many were forced to flee to the only place that seemed safe, their longtime rivals, the Forerunners. When they arrived, however, they found that the contagion had beaten them there. The scene shifted to the bridge of an Ancestor warship overlooking a Forerunner planet. The ship was crewed by several humans, some of which were the ancestors of Faunus. A few had antlers or horns, others had secondary ears or tails. They were a distinct minority, however, but none of the others present paid it any heed. For Thensho, one of the technicians addressed their leader, his native Adamic tongue translated by Jin for them to understand. His voice was trembling, and he revealed, "Scans are complete. The parasite, it's already here." For Thensho took a deep breath, his white tattoos on his face emphasizing his dismay. He then sullenly ordered, "Initiate the firebreak." But Lord of Admirals, shouldn't we warn the Forerunners? There is no time, and we cannot risk the shaping sickness spreading even further. Forthencho simply replied as he walked over to the weapons console, where he began typing instructions. As the bridge crew silently complied with the order, Forthencho softly prayed, "May the brothers forgive me for this." He inputted one final command, and the entire Ancestor fleet fired onto the Forerunner world. It reminded Ashbin and the others watching of when the Covenant glassed a human colony, only at a rate not even the largest Covenant fleet could match. At least the Lord of Admirals doing it did, so only because he felt he had no choice, but that begged the question as to what this parasite was. What was so dangerous about it that a civilization as advanced as the Ancestors felt the need to destroy entire worlds to contain it? It was obviously a disease of some kind, and civilizations falling to plague was not unheard of. But then why were they losing fleets and armies to it? Jin made it sound like they were fighting the shaping sickness, like they were waging a war rather than containing a pandemic. Usually, Jin would be all too happy to go into copious amounts of detail. Like any good storyteller, she liked to have the audience understand the exact context behind everything. And yet she wasn't delving into specifics here. In fact, she seemed scared to do so. Part of Ashbin desperately wanted to know exactly what the Ancestors were fighting, but he had to bite his tongue. They only had one other question, and they needed to save it. The Forerunners did not understand the reason behind humanity's sudden and aggressive expansion, and from their capital of Maethrillion, moved quickly to figure out what to do next. Jin explained as scenes of Forerunners expressing horror and outrage over humanity's attack on their worlds played out. The scene then changed to a council chamber inside Maethrillion, which turned out to be a massive space station, the largest anyone in the room had ever seen. It consisted of several circular platforms arranged like a tower along a central rod. Ashbin had no clue just how big the space station was, but the structure appeared far larger than Remnant. Inside one of the platforms was the council amphitheater, where the highest members of each rate on the Ecumene Council debated on what to do next. The amphitheater was elaborately decorated, suspended in midair and attached to the rest of the city by various bridges, gondolas, and lifts for individual counselors. 12 spheres, undoubtedly representing the 12 original systems colonized by the Forerunners at the dawn of their interstellar civilization, glowed brightly. Humanity's barbarism has gone too far, one of the counselors declared. They've already burned dozens of our worlds and destroyed hundreds of our vessels. This transgression against the mantle cannot go unanswered. They must be punished. Many of the counselors agreed with this suggestion, raising their voices in support. Then one of the Forerunners, a warrior servant judging by his size and armor, simply raised his hand and ushered the others in the room to silence. He stepped forward and his helmet retracted, exposing his face for all to see. "I agree that humanity's aggression must be countered," the warrior servant declared. At the same time, the mantle of responsibility for all things belongs to Forerunners alone, and humanity's claim to the title is heretical. But, for as violent and purist as they may be, extermination is not the answer. To do so goes against the very tenets of the mantle. Ashbin couldn't help but scoff at the hypocrisy, with Crow rolling his eyes. They had already seen what the Forerunners did, and if humanity was considered to be so purist, why ally with the Sanshiom? At the same time, this warrior servant seemed to genuinely believe in what he was saying. And Jin didn't exactly say when that one planet and its people was destroyed. It likely occurred well before his time, or perhaps after. Either way, it didn't really matter, and Ashbin was experienced enough to recognize where the winds were blowing. "You make a fair, if uncomfortable point, didact," a builder replied as he held his hand up near his chin, his head completely encased by his angular helmet. "What do you suggest we do then?" "We neutralize them, Master Builder," the didact suggested, much to the council's shock. The woman next to him, a life shaper, even seemed angry at the suggestion. "Drive humanity back to their homeworld of Erdityrene and, in accordance with the mantle, reduce them to a state to where they can never threaten the galaxy again." The other counselors mumbled among themselves as they considered the didact's proposal. Some, like the Master Builder, seemed more open to it. Others, including the life worker beside the didact, seemed to disagree. "We may be able to strip humanity of their technology and civilization, but what of their paracausal abilities?" the life worker pointed out. "It may pale in comparison to the glories of the precursors, true, but they are still superior than ours, and are natural to their very being." "You have a point, librarian," the didact admitted, "but are there not two life workers in your rate who are the foremost experts in neural physics in the entire Ecumene? I've seen their neural constructs in action, and they have proven to be effective, if difficult to control or understand. If they can make those abhorrent monstrosities, as you've called them, stripping humanity of its paracausal ability should be possible." The librarian frowned, then sighed and admitted, Yes, they should be able to. If nothing else, I would relish for the opportunity to use their talents in a more constructive manner. Indeed, the master builder agreed as he clenched his fist almost greedily. What's more, this represents a perfect opportunity to study humanity's paracausal abilities up close. We may not get a better chance again. I support the Didact's motion. With the master builder supporting his longtime friend and ally, Jin explained as the other Forerunner counselors, one by one, added their support to the Didact's plan. The Forerunners settled on their goal. They may not have understood why humanity was suddenly attacking them, but many didn't desire to. After all, it finally gave them the justification they needed to do away with their bitter rivals. They saw a massive Forerunner fleet embark towards human space, with the Didact leading the charge from his personal warship, which was the size of a small moon. Jin continued. The Didact led the counterattack personally from his flagship, the Mantle's approach, and embarked on a star-hopping campaign across human space. The ancestors found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. While the bulk of their attention was on the parasite, the Forerunners' retribution reduced entire worlds to ash. The scene shifted to show Ancestor and Forerunner fleets engaging one another across vast star systems. The Forerunners' military outnumbered the humans every single time, but the humans compensated with effective tactics and the use of the Precursor star roads to devastating effect. It reminded Ashbin and the others somewhat of how the Human Covenant War has gone, and much like that campaign, all their efforts seemed to do was buy them just a little more time. Despite the humans' valiant resistance, their worlds fell one by one, millions dying on both sides in the process as human space shrunk further and further. Several times Ashbin saw the Didact leading the attack both on the ground and on his ship. Other times, they'd see him tearfully cradling the bodies of fallen warriors. A funeral procession followed each one, and he was joined by the librarian and a few others as they paid their respects towards them. With each funeral, the number of Forerunners was reduced by one, until it was eventually just the Didact and the librarian alone. Only then did Ashbin realize what was going on. The Didact and the librarian were husband and wife, and these funerals were of their children. In time, the parasite receded, granting the illusion of victory, Jin revealed, but the damage humanity had suffered was too great. Their fleets were decimated, their armies exhausted, and they were reduced to a fraction of their former state. But they were too proud to surrender to the Forerunners, and the Forerunners too wrathful to offer it. As the Forerunners laid siege to Charam Hacker for 53 years, and their Sanchoam allies turned against them to save themselves from the Forerunners' fury, some suggested unleashing the parasite as one final act of retribution. But their leaders refused, preferring defeat by the Forerunners over allowing their true enemy to spread. Ashbin and the others watched as the Ancestors and Forerunners waged a terrible war over Charam Hacker. Its once proud cities burned and crumbled as both sides fought each other with a ferocity Ashbin had never seen. As it was in space, the Forerunners outnumbered humanity nearly 10 to 1, and their technology eclipsed the Ancestors completely. But with their skill and magic, humanity was able to counteract much of what the Forerunners could do. The strongest of them seemed to take hundreds at once, reshaping the planet around them and reducing all of their foes to dust before falling to the Forerunners. Much to Ashbin and the Remnantians' horror, they saw the Forerunners unleash familiar beasts onto terrified humans. The beasts didn't look exactly as they were now. For one, their eyes and markings were neon blue rather than red. But a grim was a grim, no matter the size, shape, or color. These must have been the neural constructs the Didact had mentioned. And as the Forerunners unleashed these weapons of terror onto their foes, it was clear that even they could barely control them. The remainder after any attack needed to be put down, and the Forerunners couldn't get too close lest they risk getting attacked themselves. Eventually, they saw Forthencho in his command center as it was breached by warrior servants. As his world burned around him, many of his soldiers prepared to fire their weapons. Instead, the exhausted Lord of Admirals gave the order to lower their weapons, and finally surrendered. The scene shifted, and thousands of human prisoners were herded into camps by the victorious Forerunners. Forthencho himself was strapped to a table, and the Didact approached him. His helmet was retracted, allowing his wounds to be seen. The Forerunner was visibly angry at the human laid out in front of him, but at the same time, there seemed to be a modicum of respect. Didact, Forthencho said as he matched the Didact's eyes with his own. Lord of Admirals, the Didact replied as he stood in front of the table the human was strapped onto. My finest opponent. Spare me your flattery. Forthencho angrily spat. We both know why you're here. Your fleets, your armies, they've seen it. You've seen it. The Didact was quiet at first. Then he replied, The mantle accepts all who live fiercely, who defend their young, who build and struggle and grow, and even those who dominate, as humans have dominated, cruelly and without wisdom. But for all of us, there's a time like this, when the domain seeks to confirm our essences, and for you, that time is now. Know this, relentless enemy, killer of our children, Lord of Admirals. Soon we will face the enemy you have faced and defeated. I can see that challenge coming to the Forerunners, and so do many others, and we are afraid. With that, the Didact turned to leave, and Forerunner life shapers emerged to wheel the Lord of Admirals away. He, along with countless other ancestors, were brought before a massive obelisk-like device. It glowed a bright orange. Then every single human was consumed by the flash. Their skin was burned away, followed by their muscles and bones. Only piles of ashes marked where the humans once were. Many Forerunners were present, including most of the counselors. The Didact was looking on stoically, while the librarian looked sad and regretful. Only the Master Builder seemed pleased by the end result, and Ashbin quickly noticed how the distance between him and the Didact seemed to have grown. With the ancestors defeated, the Forerunners enacted their retribution. She revealed, as two Forerunner life shapers were seen from behind working on human gene sequences, carefully removing entire chunks of it. The scene then moved to primitive Earth as once sprawling cities were replaced by thatch huts. Some small cities dotted the land, the largest of which was in East Africa situated at the meeting of two large rivers. But its wooden structures and water wheels were nothing compared to what came before. Humanity's gifts of strength and paracasuality, bestowed to them by their creators, were ripped away, Jin sadly revealed. They were reduced to a pitiful, weakened state, a shadow of the glory they once held, then placed back onto Ur-Terrene, their history forgotten and reduced to mere myth and legend. Most were reduced to primitive hunter-gatherers, but while some attempted to rebuild their civilization, they would never again reach the heights they once held. As for the Forerunners, Jin continued, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. They now knew the truth behind humanity's aggression. They were not expanding, they were running, and now the enemy humanity had seemingly defeated was inevitably going to set its sights onto them. What's more, their victory had weakened the Forerunners as well. They could not face this foe as they did before, and so the Ecumene set about planning on how to do so. 1,000 solutions were tried and tested, and old friendships gave way to heated, bitter rivalries. They watched as the Didact and Master Builder furiously debated over something. What was, Ashbin didn't know, nor could they hear what they were saying. Eventually, the Didact and his rate seemingly lost whatever debate they held with the Builders, and the Didact entered a massive sphere before going into exile. But as their new foe's approach grew ever closer, Jin declared, the Forerunners, under the watchful eye of the Master Builder, turned to an old enemy for a solution. The scene shifted once again, and the modern humans bore witness to what could only be described as a laboratory. They weren't able to tell how large it was, only that it was big and consisted of multiple layers arranged in a sphere-like manner. The section Jin's story was focusing on was in the center, connected via several hallways and corridors that spread out like a spider's web. Several tubes made up of a translucent material rested on podiums near the outer walls, with holographic displays and terminals attached to each of them. In the center of the chamber were two Forerunners, the same life workers they had seen when humanity was devolved. Each wore identical armors, but whereas one had golden yellow highlights, the other was a dark purple. After a moment, a small, bright flash of light popped into existence as a spherical drone, which looked like a floating eye teleported in. John immediately focused his attention on it, thinking of the unidentified drone he and Blue Team had spotted during Mountain Glen's evacuation. Was this the same thing? He strongly suspected it was, but until he had hard confirmation, he wasn't going to settle on anything. Greetings, sirs, the drone announced its presence. The Master Builder has arrived. He desires an audience with you both. It spoke with a male voice in a posh, British-like accent, making John wonder if the drone naturally spoke that way, or if Jin was simply translating the Forerunner speech so that it was easier for them to understand. Jin had, after all, done the same for the ancestors' language. She translated the name as Adamic, which John had immediately connected to the biblical language of the same name, the language spoken by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the supposed root of all of mankind's disparate languages, at least in the Abrahamic tradition. He wondered if it was actually called that, or if Jin was simply pulling from human culture to find an appropriate term that they'd immediately understand. Either way, John suspected that, from Adamic, all other languages of Earth had sprung, and if his theory regarding humanity's presence on Remnant was true, it might be the root language of their people as well. Still, the fact that humanity once had its own interstellar civilization that put both their current efforts and that of the Covenants to shame still astounded the Spartan. Halsey hadn't said anything, but he knew she was just as amazed as he was. Probably more. She must already be conceiving of a research expedition to find any ruins they could. Oh, and I would probably jump at the chance purely to try and reclaim some lost technology for humanity's war against the Covenant. There was something poetic about that, in John's opinion. Thank you, Censor. Please, bring him in, one of the Forerunners said after they briefly looked at each other in slight surprise, and Censor did an approximation of a nod before teleporting away. 256 Vigilant Censor seems to be performing well, the other Forerunner pointed out as he continued to type away at his terminal, while the other read the printed data being uploaded directly into his armor. Indeed, he has been a valuable assistant. The first agreed. Then both Forerunners stopped what they were doing and turned towards the nearest hallway. Just as they did, Vigilant Censor teleported back in, with the Master Builder standing right beside the Forerunner AI with his arms crossed behind his back. "Leave us, Monitor," the Master Builder ordered. Vigilant Censor seemed unsure at first, but after an approving nod from one of the Lifeworkers, the Monitor dutifully complied and teleported away, leaving the Forerunners by themselves. "Favor of will and might," the first Lifeworker announced as the Master Builder approached them. "Apologies, we were not expecting your arrival. Had we known, we would have welcomed you more warmly." "Indeed," Faber replied in an arrogant, dismissive tone. Both Lifeworkers glanced at each other once again, then the second asked, "To what do we make the pleasure?" "As I have far more important endeavors to focus my attention on, I'll get straight to the point," Faber immediately announced as he stopped right before them. "Both of you are to leave this facility at once, and are being reassigned to another. Your belongings are being transferred to my vessel as we speak." Despite not being able to see their faces, both Lifeworkers openly expressed their shock at this development. The first, whom John now assumed had to be the eldest of the pair, recovered then pointed out, "But, Master Builder, my brother and I are in the middle of very important work assigned to us by the librarian herself. We cannot just leave First Light Weave's living song to me." Faber dismissed with a wave of his hand as he walked away towards the perimeter of the room, stopping before an empty storage tub. His helmet's singular eye stared into the translucent, glass-like material, and without turning to face them, he added, "The work I'm assigning you is far more important than the conservation measure." The Lifeworkers glanced at one another, then the younger asked, "Is it the gyres? You know the Lifeworker rate vehemently opposes their creation, and the Council hasn't approved them." "No, your new assignment has nothing to do with the array," Faber clarified as he started walking around the perimeter, never once actually looking at the Lifeworkers. "But it is just as important. You recall humanity's paracausal abilities, correct?" "Yes." The eldest confirmed as a holographic depiction of a human DNA strand was displayed in the center of the room. As per the orders of the Ecumene Council, humanity was stripped of them following the end of the war when they were reseeded on Erditerrene. A process, need I remind you, that took considerable time and effort to accomplish without permanently damaging them beyond repair, the youngest added in a harsher tone. "Indeed, and the Council thanks you for your service," Faber admitted. "Now I need you to give them back." "Give them back," the oldest repeated as his arms dropped to his side in surprise, and Faber stopped his pacing and turned to face them. "Yes. May I ask why?" Faber continued his pacing again as he spoke. "We fought the humans for 1,000 years. Despite our clear technological and numerical superiority, we still lost countless warrior servants and vessels to them. Their paracausal abilities were one of the many reasons why our war took such a heavy toll on us. And despite my best efforts, all we could glean from how they worked was how devastating they could be on the battlefield." "Correct. Hence why we removed them. It made the humans a threat to the mantle. So forgive me if I fail to understand why you want to give it back after we spent so much time and effort taking it away," the youngest harshly pointed out, and Faber merely chuckled. "Oh, darkness of choice and destruction." Faber patronizingly addressed the youngest, and John noticed Ashbin's eyes widen in recognition. "I'm not assigning you and your brother this task for humanity's sake. I honestly don't care for humanity. They're a violent, barbaric race. Frankly, I've never understood the librarian's change of heart regarding them." "Then what do you want?" the eldest asked, and Faber turned his head towards him. "What I want, light of knowledge and creation, is for you to find a way to take humanity's natural paracausal abilities and give them to us, the true bearers of the mantle," Faber declared, and John heard Ashbin let out a heavy sigh as he realized something John couldn't. Faber's declaration stopped whatever protests the brothers might have had, and instead, they looked at each other in surprise. That surprise soon gave way to open scientific curiosity, and Darkness admitted, a chance to study their abilities in detail without obstruction. "I must admit, the possibilities intrigue me," Light admitted as he held his arm up near his chest and curled his six-fingered hand. "Precisely. More importantly, their abilities could ensure Forerunner dominance continues over the galaxy," Faber declared. "Path Tolgreth is a wild, chaotic storm filled with barbaric species who wish nothing more than to disturb the carefully preserved peace that life depends upon in the pursuit of power, risking annihilation for every living being. Only through the firm, guiding hand of the Forerunners alone can life continue to thrive, and to do that we need every advantage. Humanity's paracausality is but one such advantage, one we cannot let slip from our fingers. After all, we've already seen firsthand what manifesting even a fraction of their abilities can do for us. All three Forerunners turned towards one of the storage tubes, which lit up automatically to show a glowing red crystal suspended in midair. John and the others immediately recognized it as a burned dust crystal, with sparks of red energy occasionally shooting off of it into the sides of the container to no effect. These paracausal flakes of yours, light, have already proven to be tremendously valuable, augmenting our technology and weapons across the entire ecumene beyond anything even I could have conceived of, Faber admitted, and light of knowledge and creation seemed to preen at the praise. Manufacturing of the flakes is limited at the moment, but I hope to improve production and quality soon, Light told them, and the master builder nodded. Faber then turned to darkness of choice and destruction and added, in your neural constructs, darkness terrorized humanity unlike anything else we fielded against them. A shame they can't be fully controlled in large numbers. A design flaw I am currently in the process of addressing, Darkness declared somewhat defensively. I'm certain you will do so, Faber assured him as he moved towards the center of the room once again. As part of a new assignment, I am granting you unrestricted access to Shield World 0004, designation Remnant. A stable population of humans have already been transplanted onto Remnant's surface from Tyrene, so you should be able to start your work immediately. A contingent of builder security, along with sentinels, will ensure your work continues unimpeded. Both life workers glanced at each other. Then Light pointed out, I must warn you, Master Builder, that giving humanity back their paracausality will be vastly more difficult than taking it away. It is always easier to break something than it is to put it back together, and removing it in the first place was already difficult enough. That alone will take centuries, if not thousands of years. Multiply that several times to find a way to give it to ourselves, Darkness added, and Faber nodded. I suspected as much, Faber replied. Do not worry. I care little for how long it takes you to accomplish this task, nor do I care what methods you use to do so. All I care about is whether you'll be able to do it. The Master Builder paused, then he pointedly asked, Can you? Without a moment's hesitation, both life workers nodded, then in unison answered, Yes. Good, Faber said, then the scene shifted. Under the direction of the Master Builder, indisputably the most powerful Forerunner in the galaxy, the two brothers set out to accomplish their newly given task, Jin announced as she showed both Forerunners, joined by 256 Vigilant Sensor, exit slipspace over Remnant, whose moon was noticeably intact. As they descended onto the planet before a large gathering of humans, many fearfully ran from the aliens, hiding in the deepest caves and thickest forests. This only served to annoy the Forerunners, who dispassionately set about experimenting on them. To make their task easier, the brothers took advantage of humanity's culture and began to co-opt symbols and iconography. Jin added as the Forerunners once again descended from the clouds near a large gathering of humans. Instead of taking their natural forms, however, their bodies were covered by hard light projections that made them indistinguishable from the two precursors they saw earlier, who had created humanity in the first place, as well as the Forerunners themselves. Unlike before, the humans didn't run. Instead, they came to the brothers willingly, awestruck at the sight of their gods, and started worshipping at their feet. Some were even offered up as sacrifices, whom the brothers all too eagerly took. John briefly broke his focus to look at the Remnantians in the room with them. They all had a storm of emotions on their faces, save for Ashbin, who simply looked resigned. Of course they were fake, Ashbin muttered as he hung his head, his entire worldview collapsing before his very eyes. We were test subjects, Ironwood growled, absolutely livid as he clenched his mechanical fist, his arm whirring under the strain. So, it would seem, Halsey calmly replied, watching as the two brothers began to oversee the population of humans on Remnant, who, much like their cousins on Earth, had been reduced to simple hunter-gatherers. John couldn't help but notice that there were no faunus living among them, nor Grim hunting them. You suspected this, didn't you? Goodwitch accused, and Halsey nodded. Yes, she admitted, but nothing to this extent. Anything else went unsaid as they watched humanity's development across the now confirmed artificial world. Tribes of humans roamed across Anima and Sanus, hunting game, fish, and reaping the fruits of the land. After some time, primitive villages began to form as the Remnantians discovered agriculture. The Forerunners were ever present, with sentinels watching their every move with cold, dispassionate eyes. Every so often, humans would be brought into the brothers' lab, whether by abduction, sacrifice, or tribute from Remnant's nascent societies. Most of the time, it was individuals, Sometimes it was families, even entire tribes. The structure itself was nothing special, simply a large spire of metal on an island whose tip pierced the clouds. What truly caught John's attention was the fact that the lab was located inside the planet. Remnant is hollow, Crow muttered, and Ashbin nodded. Yes, he answered. You're looking at the garden. That's just a children's bedtime story, Theodore pointed out, but Ashbin shook his head. By now, you should know better than most that most stories have a kernel of truth behind them, Ashbin said as he rested his hands atop his cane. Ironwood narrowed his eyes, then accused. Did you know they were Forerunners? No, James, Ashbin immediately answered. Until recently, I had no reason to believe otherwise. But you failed to tell us about this, Ironwood pointed out. What else are you hiding? I'm now more concerned about what else I haven't truly known all this time, Ashbin wearily replied, and Ironwood's glare deepened. Branwen, Goodwitch, and Theodore looked ready to jump to Ashbin's defense, but they were distracted by scenes of the two brothers cruelly experimenting on captured humans. John got the sense that they were all about to learn about a lot more things Ashbin hadn't told any of them regardless, something he was slightly irritated about. If Ashbin had been more forthcoming, perhaps the grim tide could have been averted and thousands would have been saved. At the same time, however, he felt that Ironwood's accusation was unwarranted. It was clear that Ashbin had no idea the beings he worshipped as gods were Forerunners. He was too distraught for that, even if he was making a good show of hiding his emotions. Rather than say anything, though, the Master Chief stayed silent, preferring to focus on the information being presented in front of him. As the gods of this world, the two brothers watched as humanity grew and spread across Remnant. Jin declared as the passage of time increased tremendously across the planet. Tribes settled into villages. Villages became cities. Cities became kingdoms. Kingdoms became empires. Of course, even in this primitive stage, mankind's proclivity for violence was never abated, and so their civilizations repeatedly collapsed before restarting the cycle all over again. John and the others watched as the various cities fell into ruin, only to reform later on after an indeterminate amount of time. It was as though he was watching humanity's development on Earth. If anything, it was happening far faster, probably because it was being sped up by the Forerunners observing them as part of their experiments. As Remnant civilization started to settle, the early signs of the Forerunners' work started to show themselves as Stone Age humans began experimenting with minor usage of magic. On the surface, it seemed hopeful, but John had to wonder how many humans had suffered to get to that point. Soon, the scene shifted back to their lab, where the two brothers were joined by the Master Builder once again. It entered into the middle of a conversation, where they heard Darkness of Choice and Destruction say, "We've managed to successfully reintegrate paracausality into the human population. Starting from individuals, the DNA naturally spread from generation to generation. We've had to induce societal collapse to ensure that human societies wouldn't segregate those with paracausality as a ruling caste over those who did not. But within 2 generations, I predict that every human on Remnant will be capable of wielding paracausality. We've even begun experiments on spreading paracausality to the native wildlife. Results are early, but promising." "Excellent," the Master Builder said as he wandered over to 4 storage podiums, where they saw the Lamp of Knowledge being held alongside 3 other matching items. What they were went unsaid, but John knew they were the other relics. As they approached the podiums, the Master Builder tersely added, "By the way, Darkness of Choice and Destruction, I regret to inform you that your neural construct's effectiveness against the parasite has proven to be insufficient." Darkness growled in frustration, then sighed and reluctantly replied, "As I feared. While my creation's use against small-scale infestations fell in line with our projections, their ability to contain large-scale outbreaks is sadly limited as per those same predictions. I was hoping to be proven wrong." "Indeed," the Master Builder continued as he stopped before the podiums and said, "I see you've been busy." "Correct. Our expeditions into humanity's ruined civilization has borne many fruits which have helped our efforts tremendously," Light of Knowledge and Creation proudly declared, only to flinch when the Master Builder abruptly turned to face him. "Yet not the one I've tasked you with," Faber said. "What of your progress into giving paracausality to the Forerunners?" "Ah, yes," Light murmured as he pressed a holographic projection, causing a 5th storage container to emerge. This one looked remarkably different, smaller and more organic than the other relics. It vaguely reminded John of a rotten apple. "What's that?" Ironwood asked, and Ashbin sighed. "That is the apple," Ashbin revealed, then shook his head in resignation. "I'd save your questions, James. I suspect Jin is already going to give you the information as part of this question. Unless the General wants me to answer them," Jin teased, and Ironwood could only grumble before going silent, allowing Jin to continue her story. Light then said, As part of our research, we've created this, a paracausal inducer. It will grant any sapient being, regardless of species, paracausality, and pass it along to their children. With enough practice, they can then spread it to other members of their species. Only there's, however, cross-species paracausality administration appears beyond its abilities. Not even subspecies. Why wasn't I notified of this development? Faber asked, his anger leaking into his voice. Because, Master Builder, the inducer was a failure, Darkness revealed. It doesn't grant one full paracausality, merely a fraction, a semblance of its full potential. More importantly, most of the test subjects died during the experiments. They experienced seizures, myocardial infarctions, aneurysms, and more as their bodies tore themselves apart. I see, Faber said as he studied the inducer. And the ones who survived? They described every cell and every nerve of their body as though it was on fire. Light answered. We don't know exactly how they survived. The first non-animal test subjects were the healthiest Builder security had to offer, equal in health and form. All but one died. The next were some of the life workers assigned to assist us. Half of them perished. There is no biological pattern to survival. If anything, it seems to be a matter of personal will. Personal will? Faber asked in obvious suspicion, which the two brothers clearly shared. We don't exactly know, Darkness admitted. In fact, sapient-level intelligence seems to make it more difficult. All that we can tell is that the survivors appeared to have a stronger sense of self, perseverance, and willpower than the ones who died. Those who seemed to think more for themselves survived. Those who did not perished. It's fascinating. I care little about why they survived, Faber harshly declared, then sighed. I can see why you've deemed it a failure. However, the rejection rate is too high, and I imagine it would take too long to spread it among our entire people. I'm also not interested in a mere fraction of humanity's full capabilities. Frankly, I'm surprised you've kept this thing. Although the inducer was a dead end, it was an important first step, Light pointed out. So it's a keepsake. Essentially, Faber stared at the brothers, then said, I have sponsored this experiment for thousands of years. My patience may be vast, but it is not endless. The ecumene demands results, not useless trinkets. Of course, Master Builder, both brothers replied, and Faber teleported out of the lab without saying another word. With newfound urgency, the brothers continued their work. Jin explained as they watched the two Forerunner lifeworkers experiment on more and more humans. Humanity, meanwhile, continued to develop, grow, and prosper under their watchful eyes. Not knowing the truth, the humans of Remnant believed that the brothers were their gods and creators, distant, yet present and benevolent. This pleased the brothers, for it not only made their work easier, but also stoked their inherent pride and arrogance. The scene shifted to show flocks of pilgrims gathering around a verdant spring, with a vibrant, golden tree resting on a small pedestal surrounded by crystal blue water and a field of golden flowers. The Brother of Light's hard light projection hovered over the humans as they worshipped at his feet, while the actual lifeworker continued his research and experiments in his lab. Despite being unable to see his face, judging by how often Light of Knowledge and Creation looked up at a monitor displaying a video feed of his shrine, John could tell he liked what he was seeing. But humanity's devotion was not equal, Jin clarified as she showed Darkness Subchase and Destruction's shrine. Unlike his brothers, Darkness' shrine was in a dark, crystalline wasteland. Massive pools of grim, tar dotted the landscape alongside large dust crystals. From the tar pools came the grim, frightening away any humans who would dare to approach. As more and more humans avoided the land of darkness in favor of the domain of light, Darkness watched and fumed as his brother received all the adoration while he received none. Petty rivalries and sibling squabbles began to push the brothers apart, threatening the very task they were assigned to do. Jin told them as she showed scenes of the brothers arguing. They couldn't hear what was being said, but the point was made regardless. As progress stalled, frustrations mounted and grew. Jin explained, showing Faber increasingly growing impatient with the two brothers, as did their own reservations over what they were doing. The scene then shifted again as the two brothers worked on terminals on opposite ends of their shared lab. Neither of them said a word, the silence stretching out for eternity. Then Light broke the silence and asked, Brother, do you believe what we're doing adheres to the mantle? Why do you ask? Darkness replied, refusing to turn his head and look his brother in the eyes. I've been speaking with the librarian, updating her on our progress, Light answered. She disapproves. Of course she does, especially after what Faber did to her husband. Darkness dismissed. Our work is commissioned entirely by the Master Builder. Anything he touches, she despises by default. Think nothing of it. Yes, but I got the sense that she seemed offended by our work on a personal level. She told me that she believes we're interfering too much in humanity's development. I seem to recall that the humans on Erdityrene worship her as a goddess. I pointed the hypocrisy out to her as well. Light sighed and finally turned around to look at his brother. Still, part of me fears that she may be correct. Darkness turned around to look at his brother, then claimed, "The librarian has never approved of our work." "She's never approved of yours," Light corrected, and John could see Darkness' frustration and ire grow as he shook his head. "Regardless, her approval is irrelevant. Our work is crucial to ensure the prosperity of the Forerunners and life itself," Darkness declared. "Or have you let humanity's adulation go to your head?" Light didn't say anything. Instead, the two brothers glared at each other. Then they each turned around and went back to their work. Despite Darkness' words, from the way he momentarily paused, John got the sense that he, too, was conflicted. Time continued to pass, and remnant civilization entered what appeared to be the medieval era. John noticed Ashbin's eyes widen in recognition, and he almost moved as though he was going to demand that Jin stop. But he didn't, instead biting his tongue and averting his eyes entirely. John got the sense that they were about to learn something that Ashbin would have preferred to stay buried, and so he refocused his attention on what Jin was about to show them. In the Forerunners' twilight years, Remnant's first civilization reached its apex, Jin revealed. It was a land of heroes and villains, magic and monsters. Adventurers roamed the land, seeking fame, glory, and more. Everyone's eyes, save for John's, immediately turned towards Ashbin, whose eyes were clenched shut while his head hung forward in shame. John, meanwhile, watched as Jin showed Osma wandering the land. In his hand was a staff topped by an emerald gem that matched his tunic, adorned with elaborate golden trim. He wore plates of steel armor over his tunic and brown pants, protecting him as he fought familiar and unfamiliar beasts, protected the innocent, and won the adulation of countless people. John had to admit, as he watched Osma do battle, he was impressed. The man's fighting skills, combined with his magical abilities, more than backed up Jin's claims. Osma reminded him of modern-day huntsmen. Given Ashbin's true nature, he wondered if that was deliberate. One day, Osma set out on a new quest to save a young, beautiful woman trapped in a tower by her controlling father, a woman named Salem. "What the fuck?" Crow gasped as they saw Osma fight a massive figure in black and red armor, whose sword was nearly as long as he was tall. Many before had attempted to free the trapped maiden from her tyrannical father. Jin explained as the battle continued to a throne room, where Osma dueled an old man and his remaining forces, the Lord throwing powerful magic while Osma fought with spell, staff, and sword. Osma hoped to succeed where they had failed. The battle was fierce, and never before had Osma faced such a foe. But after a long, arduous battle against both the Lord and his forces, Osma emerged victorious and set out to claim his prize. As Osma looked down at the Lord's broken body and those of his knights and golems that lied at his feet, he rushed to the top of the tower and broke down the door. Inside, just as Jin claimed, was a young woman with fair skin, long, flowing blonde hair mostly tied in a simple bun, and light blue eyes. She was wearing a two-piece dress, a sleeveless, white pleated top, and a white skirt with a slight purple tint. Osma and Salem locked eyes with each other. Salem especially seemed surprised to see someone other than her cruel father there, and soon the two softly smiled at one another. Free after a lifetime of imprisonment, Salem and Osma quickly fell in love. Jin revealed as she showed Osma and Salem riding on horseback away from her tower, followed by scenes of them laughing, talking, and kissing. Crow could only give a scandalized sputter through his anger as the other Remnantians looked at their leader, their faces filled with incredulous betrayal. But this happiness was fleeting, and not even a warrior as skilled and powerful as Osma could escape the passage of time. Jin sadly continued, showing Salem tearfully attempting to tend to a now bedridden and gaunt Osma. Osma fell ill, and not even the most powerful magic and potions could cure him. Despite her best efforts, Osma passed away, and Salem was left alone once again. They saw Salem weeping over Osma's grave. Then she tearfully and angrily asked herself, why would the gods do this? Everyone paused. Then slowly they, even John, turned towards Halsey, who merely looked on stoically at the woman who sounded exactly like her. Halsey wasn't openly reacting, but John knew her better than anyone else in the room. He knew she was just as perplexed as the rest of them, if not more so. John certainly didn't have an answer as to how that coincidence could have possibly happened. He also didn't particularly care beyond idle curiosity, deeming it unimportant. Salem refused to accept Osma's death, to have her first true happiness ripped away from her so cruelly. Jin explained as she showed Salem leaving his grave and setting out on a quest of her own. Knowing that her own powers were too limited to accomplish such a task, she set out towards the only being she knew who could possibly bring her love back to life, the brothers she worshipped as her gods. They watched as Salem carefully trekked up the canyon path towards the domain of light. Salem held Osma's staff in her hands, and she was clearly nervous as she walked up to the pool. Going down onto her knees, she laid Osma's staff before her, then prayed at the altar with absolute reverence. "Brother of light, please hear my prayer. I need your guidance," Salem prayed. At first, nothing happened. Then a sudden yet gentle wind flowed through the canyon shrine. From the water emerged the Brother of Light's godly form, who towered over Salem as she looked up at him in awe. "Speak, child," the Brother of Light said, his voice echoing and reverberating across the shrine. Salem was nervous, and she gulped before answering, "My husband, Osma, he has passed away." "Yes." His soul now rests peacefully in the domain. The brother attempted to soothe her. John had to wonder if he was being genuine or simply living up to his co-opted image. "That pleases me, but that is not enough," Salem insisted. "He was taken from me far too soon. We had plans, dreams, yet life was cruel enough to rip him away from me. Please restore my love to the land of the living. I beg of you. We deserve to live our lives together." The Brother of Light said nothing at first, then said, "This I cannot do." "What?" Salem asked, completely surprised. As she shot up to her feet, she said, "But you are the Brother of Light, God of creation. Surely you can restore someone to life." "I refuse to do so," the brother said, and from his tone John got the sense that the brother's true personality was showing. He sounded almost offended, but he quickly returned to a more divine, fatherly tone as he continued. "Understand, child, that life cannot exist without death. It is a delicate cycle, one that is not meant to be disturbed. To do so is cruelty beyond imagining, and I will not suffer your husband through this. Is it not cruelty to die young, to leave your loved ones behind to wallow in misery?" Salem demanded, her earlier reverence replaced by pure rage. "Life isn't cruel, nor is it kind," Light proclaimed. "It simply is. I feel your loss, child, but I will not do what you ask of me. That isn't fair," Salem shouted, reminding John of a petulant child, but the Brother of Light remained unmoved. "Let him rest," Light sternly commanded. "Live your life the way he would have wanted you to. In time, you'll see each other again. That I can guarantee." With his final words spoken, the Brother of Light's godly body disappeared back into the pool, leaving a fuming and crying Salem behind as she was teleported to the front of the canyon. As she picked up Osma's staff, she said, "I wanted to live my life with him." Her eyes then hardened, and as she turned around to leave, Jin spoke up again, with the Brother of Light refusing to grant her wish and refusing to accept Osma's death. Salem turned towards the other. This time, Jin showed Salem walking through the land of darkness. The various species of Grimm snapped and snarled at her, but none actually moved to attack. Salem kept her head up high, refusing to show any fear as she approached the Brother of Darkness shrine. As she did in the domain of light, Salem prayed to the brother, and soon he emerged out from the pool of annihilation around them. Unlike the Brother of Light, the Brother of Darkness had a more theatrical flair to his arrival, pulling himself out from the pool while contorting his body in an unnatural way. Salem was frightened, but refused to show it. "What brings you to my shrine?" Darkness demanded. "None have ever approached before. I seek your aid and wisdom," Salem proclaimed. "You do? Intriguing." Darkness replied, his pleasure at finally having a human directly worshipping him as a god showing. Salem clearly recognized this as well, and remained silent as the brother continued. "Well then, child, what do you need?" "My husband, Osma, fell ill and passed away," Salem revealed. "Our plans to travel the world, to start a family, were ended before they could ever begin. Brother of Darkness, I beg of you, please restore my love to life." Darkness was silent at first, then he asked, "I must admit, I'm surprised you've come to me for this. Mankind has never once sought me out for favor. For something like this, you typically would go to my brother." "I knew this was a desire only you could fulfill, my lord," Salem declared, and John raised an eyebrow. She was deliberately making it seem as though she went to the Brother of Darkness first. A bold-faced lie, one that the Forerunner eagerly bought after a moment of silence. "Rise, child," Darkness of Choice and Destruction proclaimed as Salem smiled and rose to her feet, Osma's scepter held tightly against her chest, "and let your faith in me be rewarded. It will take time to restore your husband to life, but I assure you, he will live again." Eager to bask in the adulation he had never received before, and eager to see if he could use what he had learned over thousands of years in such a manner, the Lifeworker set out to do what Salem had asked of him. Jin revealed as she showed the Forerunner working furiously in his personal lab. Restoring Osma's personality was easy enough. Backups of their test subjects' minds were stored in the domain, and retrieving it was simple. Restoring his body was just as easy. A new one could be grown from samples of his DNA. But darkness desired to go beyond that, to not simply create a copy and declare it the original. He wanted to push his skills and mastery of neural physics to the test, to truly cross the boundary between life and death, and restore what had once been lost. It would be a shining monument to his skills as a life worker, and that brilliance blinded him to everything else. Eventually, he succeeded in doing what had never been done before. Time passed, and Salem, camping near the shrine, patiently waited for the Brother of Darkness to restore Osma back to life. Eventually, the brother returned triumphant, and as Salem eagerly ran up to the shrine, the brother theatrically spread his arms before focusing on them. A sphere of pulsating light emerged, which washed over Salem as she eagerly ran towards it. The light intensified, becoming blinding as it consumed everything nearby, including Salem herself, who was forced to cover her eyes and look away. When the light disappeared, Osma's restored body lay before Salem. She immediately cried out and cradled him in her arms. As she did, Osma awoke with a start and fell into what could only be described as a panic attack. "Where am I? What is this? Where am I?" Osma screamed in horrified confusion as Salem tried to comfort him. "It's okay. Everything is going to be okay," she claimed, but that did little to calm Osma's nerves. Before she could say anything else, they heard a roar of thunder, followed by the Brother of Light emerging in a flash of golden light. His face was featureless, but John knew he was furious. "What have you done?" Light demanded, and Darkness merely chuckled. "I have done what I please, brother, and what you never could. You may claim the powers of creation, but you do not own them," Darkness claimed, and Light seemed to grow angrier. "This," Light declared as he pointed his arm towards a terrified and distressed Osma, "is not creation. This is a violation of the mantle. Do not lecture me on the mantle," Darkness shouted, and Light grew silent. A moment later, Light whispered, "I will do what needs to be done to save our project from your impulsiveness." Osma's body glowed a bright orange. Then he disintegrated in Salem's arms. She cried out, "Eno, what have you done? Bring him back to me." The brothers ignored her as they squared up against each other, a lifetime of petty squabbles finally coming to the forefront. Darkness claimed, "You just couldn't let me have this, could you? You couldn't dare to let just one human come to me? You had to have them all for yourself. This isn't about petty worship, brother. This is about the mantle itself." Light countered, "Death is not meant to be reversed. You should recognize this, especially now. You should have refused her, just as I did." "Just as you did?" Darkness quietly asked, and Light's hard light body leaned forward. "She came to me weeks ago," Light revealed, "and I told her no, because, unlike you, I respect the mantle. More importantly, I was aware of the consequences of what violating it would do. The Master Builder's position is increasingly threatened on the Ecumene Council, even if he's too blinded by his arrogance to see it. They are beginning to look more closely at what we are doing on this world. We've already violated these humans enough as it is. If word got out of what you just did, they will shut us down, and this experiment would have been for nothing." Darkness was stunned into silence, and John could tell that the impulsive Forerunner hadn't truly thought through his actions. Only now, with his older brother spelling it out directly in front of him, did he realize the truth. Shame and fear coursed through his fake body, clearly echoing the real one. That was when Salem slowly stood up and looked at the two brothers as though she had come to a realization. "Mantle," she quietly repeated, and the brothers sharply turned their heads towards her as they finally remembered she was there. "Ecumene Council? Master Builder? Experiment? You're not gods." All three in the land of darkness were silent, and Salem's anger grew. "Oh, you're both frauds. You lied to me. You've been using me this entire time." Light turned towards his brother, then softly said, "She knows too much. What are we going to do with her?" Darkness asked, and Light simply pointed his arm towards Salem. A moment later, 4 sentinels teleported in and simultaneously blasted her with beams of hard light. Salem didn't even have time to scream before she was disintegrated, leaving behind only a pile of ash where she once stood. "She left us no choice," Light whispered in an almost regretful tone as he and his brother stared at the pile for a few moments. He sighed, then continued, "At least now she can rest with her." Before the Brother of Light could finish his sentence, the pile of ash began to stir, stunning both Forerunners into silence. With open awe and horror that was shared by the modern humans present, they watched as the ash glowed and shifted. It reformed into a humanoid shape, and when the glow disappeared, a reformed Salem was in its place. She immediately let out a panicked breath and started hyperventilating as she and everyone else struggled to understand what just happened. John was the first to voice his thoughts, and he muttered, "She's immortal." What did you do to me?" Salem cried out, as the brothers silently stared down at her. A moment later, the brother of light turned towards his brother and said, "That is a very good question, brother. I don't know. That wasn't supposed to happen," the brother of darkness quietly admitted, and the brother of light growled. "You played with forces you didn't fully understand," Light told him, anger, disappointment, and a hint of curiosity in his voice. "That has consequences. How was I supposed to know my work with her mate would do this to her?" Darkness defended himself as Salem started to recover. As she looked at her trembling hands, she shifted her attention towards the brothers. Intense fury warped her face, and she immediately threw fireballs towards them. The spells, compared to master sorcerers such as Osma and her father, were nothing noteworthy and were easily absorbed by the brothers' personal energy shields. Before she could attack again, the four sentinels bound her in hard light beams, imprisoning her in place. "Should we try again?" Darkness asked as fear enveloped Salem, but Light shook her head. "No," Light refused. "I fear that whatever you did to her, accident or not, may have banished her from death entirely. I see no other explanation as to how she could recover from complete disintegration. There would be no point." "Then what do you suggest we do?" Darkness asked, cowing slightly under his brother's glare. Light stared at his brother for a few moments, then turned his attention towards Salem, who was glaring daggers at them both. He then answered, "We can't kill her, nor can we let her go. Her mere existence is now an affront to the mantle itself, and she will turn the rest of the populace against us. To correct your mistake and preserve our work, I'm afraid we have to keep her here." And so, Salem once again found herself imprisoned, this time in a tower of metal instead of stone. Jin narrated as Salem was teleported into a cell. She attempted to escape, only for a hard light wall to block her path. As the woman screamed and threw spell after spell at her enclosure, it quickly proved to everyone watching that her efforts were futile. Much like her father before them, her new jailers were cold, but not cruel, rationalizing their actions as being for the greater good as they attempted to understand the cause of her immortality. Jin continued as a still struggling Salem was teleported into a testing chamber filled with various sensors that scanned every part of her body and soul. As with her holding cell, she threw spells of fire and lighting into her surroundings to try and escape, but they weren't powerful enough to do anything. Through her futile attempts at resistance, the brothers and their assistants studied her through their monitors, none of them saying a word. And yet, in keeping her isolated for centuries, Salem suffered nonetheless. Jin added as a now thoroughly defeated Salem sat in her cell, her knees depressed her chest as she was teleported back to the testing chamber. It was a pitiful sight, not that the Remnantians present save for Ashbin cared given what she was to become. "No wonder she lost her damn mind," Lord Hood said. "She was kept in solitary confinement for centuries. That's torture." Ashbin was silent. Then he muttered, "I should have believed her." What he meant by that, John didn't know, but he didn't dare ask. Instead, he remained silent as Jin proclaimed. Despite centuries of work and study, the brothers could find nothing in their repertoire to correct their affront to the mantle and end Salem's suffering. Only one weapon could possibly do so, but it was one they dared not use. They watched as Salem was teleported in and out of her cell, escorted at all times by builder security and sentinels. But although she had long since stopped more overt attempts at resistance, her magic was still there, and beneath the Forerunner's notice, Salem practiced. Her skill and its usage grew as the centuries dragged on. Eventually, with a show of force and precision which matched Osma's at his peak, she escaped from her prison, using her curse of immortality to her advantage to escape from the lab into the garden. The brothers watched her leave, yet made no move against her. "Should we capture her?" Darkness asked, a deep sadness and regret filling his voice. "No," Light answered in a similar tone. "She suffered enough at our hands as it is. Besides, there's no point. There's no stopping it now." The brothers returned to their stations, but unlike before, their scientific furor was completely gone, the weary slump of their shoulders marking a fundamental change in their dynamic that John couldn't quite describe. "You knew," Ironwood whispered to Ashbin. "You knew this entire time that she was immortal?" "Yes," Ashbin sadly admitted, and Ironwood's scowl deepened. "Did you ever have a plan to stop her?" Theodore asked, and Ashbin shook his head. "No," he revealed. "I once asked Jin how I could destroy Salem. She told me I couldn't." Branwen couldn't help but bitterly laugh as he remarked, "Oh, this is perfect. All this time, you made us think we could stop her, but that was a lie. Everything you've told me was a damn lie. Why didn't you tell us the truth?" "Because you clearly couldn't handle it," Adler suddenly spoke up, catching everyone, especially Ashbin, by surprise. Turning towards the headmaster, Adler said, "Am I correct, headmaster, in assuming others have found out about this before?" After a moment, Ashbin nodded, and Adler nodded back before continuing. and what happened when they realized what they were really up against. It varied, Ashbin admitted. Most simply gave up, convinced that fighting her was pointless. I suspect this may have happened with Raven. Others betrayed me and joined Salem, much as Leonardo did. In time, I learned I couldn't trust anyone with the truth. Right, Adler remarked as he rubbed his chin, then declared, well, while I certainly believe you should have told us and your allies about Salem's true nature from the beginning, if only to prevent this, I can't exactly fault you for it, especially if this is how people react. Compartmentalization is key to any organization, and knowing Salem was immortal wasn't necessary to contain her, which is what you shifted to when you learned you couldn't defeat her, correct? Yes, Ashbin answered, a mix of conflicting emotions visible on his face. Holding the line against her conquest became the only option left. Good. That's exactly what I would have done, Adler remarked as the other UNSC personnel nodded in agreement, some more begrudgingly than others. The Remnantians looked at them like they had grown second heads, Ashbin especially. Am I supposed to feel better about being lied to my entire adult life because ONI agrees with him? Crow pointed out, but Adler merely gave him a harsh stare. How you personally feel about this, Branwen, means little to me, Adler rebuked. Keep staring down the end of your flask for all I care. Just remember that we still have a job to do. Jin, please continue. Of course, Jin said, clearly annoyed at having her story interrupted. As the scene unpaused and the story continued, John briefly focused on the other Remnantians. Branwen still fixed Ashbin with a look of tremendous betrayal, and judging by what he had read in the huntsman's profile, he could deduce why. Before entering Beacon, Crow Branwen was a member of the Branwen tribe, a collection of bandits operating in the wilderness of Anima. They'd mostly avoided tangling with the UNSC in the present day, especially after so many other bandit clans have been wiped out in the build-up to Revelation Day. But that didn't change the fact that they survived by raiding and pillaging isolated, defenseless villages and travelers wherever they went. Both Branwen and his twin sister had entered Beacon in the first place to learn how to become better fighters for their tribes. While Raven eventually went back to lead the tribe, Crow had fully been recruited, or some might say converted, by Ashbin for his fight against Salem. He idolized Beacon's headmaster, believing that he was the reason why he grew up to become something better than just a marauding bandit. Finding out that he'd been lied to by the man who saved him this entire time had to have been a tremendous blow, and it would take time to come to terms with that, if he ever could. The others were more mixed. Ironwood's earlier anger was slowly simmering down into a cool acceptance, especially after Adler pointed out Ashbin's change in strategy. From a military mindset, it wasn't hard to follow, even if he was obviously upset at not being trusted enough for the truth. Whether he'd forgive it in time, John couldn't say. Glinda and Theodore were the most accepting, Glinda especially. Lionheart's recent betrayal, still fresh on their minds, probably offered much-needed perspective. John got the sense that this information was going to get out eventually, and he was honestly glad it happened now rather than later. While the relationships were certainly frayed, he believed that they could be repaired. He didn't want to imagine how things would have turned out if the truth had been revealed under more fraught circumstances. Jin's voice cut through John's thoughts, and she declared, as the sun prepared to set on the Forerunner ecumene, the brothers had come to terms with their and their race's transgressions against the very mantle they claimed to hold dear. They were no longer concerned with the Master Builder's plans to continue Forerunner dominance into perpetuity. Instead, they had come to accept what others in their rate already had. The age of the Forerunners was drawing to a close, and one day it would become the age of the Reclaimers. The scene shifted back to their lab, where they saw the two brothers speaking with the librarian who told them, I'll be departing back to Tyrene soon. I need to index what's left, bring the samples to the Ark before it's too late. Will you return once you're done? Light of Knowledge and Creation asked, but the librarian shook her head. Librarian, I must protest. You'll be safe here, Darkness of Choice and Destruction pointed out. It's not about safety, it's about penance, the librarian said. Our transgressions, my transgressions, must be answered for. I've already selected a spot, a beautiful, snow-capped volcano from where I can watch the sun rise and set. It'll be a peaceful place for when the time comes, and I'll be able to continue my work uninterrupted until then. I see, Light whispered, then bowed with his sibling. May you find peace in the domain, Life Shaper. The librarian nodded, then asked, And what of you two? We intend to join the ISO Didact and Chantagreen on their great journey. Darkness revealed. We'll be leaving the galaxy behind, where we will fade away. But before we do, we intend to right our mistakes. We've already begun preparing to add our stock toward the Tyrenes. When humanity returns, it will be restored to its original, unaltered state. They'll be ready to accept the mantle when the time comes, as they always should have been. Good, as have I. The Hayas I've planted in humanity, in time, will allow them to reclaim what was stolen from them, the librarian declared, and she mournfully sighed. The mantle was never ours to claim. Our usurpation and abuse have only laid the seeds of our own destruction. I'd say it was deserved. The mantle was never meant to be a source of power and authority. It was meant to be a guideline for the benevolent stewardship of life, and it wasn't our place to dictate what directions or forms it took. If only our demise didn't destroy everything else in the process. What's done is done. Darkness sadly pointed out as the scene began to change. All we can do now is keep moving forward and hope our efforts at atonement will be enough. Humanity, unaware of its impending doom, grew frightened and confused as to why the brothers disappeared. Jin explained as she showed pilgrims gathered around the empty and still domain of light. People were distraught, and conflict started breaking out as kingdoms sought answers. The brothers, meanwhile, focused everything on their impending great journey, viewing their work as penance for their sins, Jin said. But, so focused on what was to come, they did not see their past transgressions coming back to haunt them. Salem had returned. The scene shifted once again, and they saw Salem re-emerge from wherever she had hidden. She was going from kingdom to kingdom, showing off her immortality to awestruck kings and queens. After centuries of torment, and now knowing the truth, Salem desired nothing but revenge against the Forerunners that had wronged her, Jin said. She claimed to captive audiences that the gods were not the infallible beings they portrayed themselves as, that they were petty, cruel, and undeserving of mankind's worship. Over the course of many years, she convinced every tribe, city, kingdom, and empire on Remnant that they should lash out against the gods and claim their gifts, including immortality, for themselves as she had. And so Salem launched her rebellion and doomed everyone. John's eyes widened as he saw all of Remnant descend into full rebellion against the Forerunners. Humans, armed with their magic and stolen Forerunner weaponry, were fighting and killing countless sentinels and builder security. The land was torn apart in the fighting. Forests burned, seas boiled, and the moon itself shattered into a more familiar shape. The Forerunners, caught completely off guard by humanity's sudden aggression, tried in vain to fight them off. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and were no true gods in the end. Salem led humanity's armies from the front, wielding terrible magic that awed everyone watching. John couldn't help but compare her performance to Osma, and found that where Osma had skill and technique on his side, Salem had brute force backed up by her immortality. As she incinerated any Forerunner that stood in her way, Glinda asked, "Is this what Salem is capable of?" "This is how she is when she takes matters into her own hands," Ashbin answered, watching silently with his hands resting on top of his cane as Salem, her face warped in wrathful fury, destroyed everything. Sentinels fired at her with hard light beams that cut through her like knives. Her arms simply reformed and blasted them out of the sky with bolts of lightning and fiery meteors. Builder security and warrior servants, tasked with protecting the two brothers, added to the volley with scattershots, suppressors, light rifles, binary rifles, and more. None of it did more than slow her for more than a few hours at most, as her body recovered from any damage inflicted upon her. When she reformed, the demoralized Forerunners could barely even put up a fight before she destroyed them. More importantly to John, however, was the collateral damage Salem was inflicting around her. She didn't care how many of her fellow humans died in her pursuit of revenge. Many were killed by her as she destroyed whatever Forerunner construct or warrior got in her way. The ones present were just as terrified of her as they were of the aliens they were fighting. Salem clearly didn't care, too consumed by her thirst for vengeance to see anything else. She broke through the Forerunners' lines, entering one of the many physical entrances to the garden. Inside she was met by even more sentinels, as many as and as far as the eye could see. She and her remaining followers were undeterred, continuing to fight onward. Remnant's internal systems suffered tremendous damage and strained under the relentless assault happening all over it, which 256 Vigilant Sensor valiantly tried to fix to little avail. From their lab, the two brothers were trying to save thousands of years of work that was being wiped away before their very eyes. Eventually, Salem broke through to the garden, where she made a beeline towards the spire she had escaped from. Sentinels, and now Grim, hounded her and her remaining forces at every turn, tearing her body apart piece by piece countless times and killing those around her. But she simply reformed, killed everything, and continued alone. When she reached the spire, she concentrated her magic into a colossal spout of flame and directed it onto a single point. She burned through the outer walls, granting her entry. The remaining security forces tried one last time to stop her, but Salem simply killed them all as she made her way towards the central lab. The defenseless life workers tried to surrender or flee, but she cut them down without care nor mercy. The walls of the complex were stained with Forerunner blood, and Salem's body was covered in it from head to foot. When she reached the lab, she found the brothers furiously typing away at their terminals, not even noticing her presence. "Light! Darkness!" Salem shouted, announcing her arrival. Only then did the brothers stop what they were doing and turn toward her, and underneath their matching helmets, John could tell they were furious. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Light hissed, and Salem simply smiled as she confidently strode forward, idly destroying a sentinel trying to attack her from above. "Oh, I'm very much aware. I've destroyed everything you've ever built," Salem declared as she held out her arms to the side. "You took everything from me. I figure it's only right to return the favor. Lifetimes of work, centuries of data, thousands of years of research gone." Light continued to rant, causing Salem's smile to grow even more. "Your short-sightedness has ruined everything. We can't fix it now." "Good," Salem simply remarked, then shot Light of knowledge and creation with a bolt of lightning. The Forerunner screamed in agony as his body spasmed, and he fell to the ground in a smoking, twitching heap. "Brother, I must thank you." "Truly," Salem said mockingly. "I wouldn't have gotten this far without your gift." Darkness was breathing heavily. Then he started to explain, "Salem, I know we have wronged you and your people, but I don't care about them." Salem screamed as she struck Darkness with an unending torrent of lighting alongside his heavily injured but still alive brother. "And I don't want your apologies. What I want is for you to suffer. Suffer as I destroy everything you've worked for." Both life workers screamed in utter agony, all while Salem cackled like a madwoman. Despite the horrific nature of their crimes against humanity, John was disgusted. Salem was more than justified in her hatred of them, but this had crossed the line into abject cruelty. It was an opinion he could tell was shared by the others in the room, with Glinda holding her hands over her mouth while the others could only stare slack-jawed at the display of copious violence. Soon, the Forerunners' armors were shattered, exposing their skin which melted and popped under the intense heat. Rather than let them die, Salem used a simple healing spell she'd learned just for this very purpose, just to prolong their suffering. Then the lab shuddered as a massive tremor coursed through all of Remnant, and only then did Salem stop to look around. She asked no one in particular, "What just happened?" Despite their grievous injuries, Darkness chuckled as he pulled himself to his brother's body. They were both just clinging to life, and without immediate medical attention, they were almost certainly doomed. They might still be. When Salem shot her attention back down onto them, Darkness laughed even harder, fighting through his agony to do so. "What did you do?" Salem demanded, and Darkness merely smiled through what remained of his jaw and cheek. "It's done. There's nothing left," Darkness claimed, and Salem's eyes widened. What do you mean, there's nothing left?" "I mean exactly what I said," Darkness replied, then violently coughed up blood onto his chest. "You mean my brother were the only living things left on this entire planet? You made sure of that?" He chuckled again, then added, "Like 1,000 other plans tried and failed. Millions of brave and honored souls dying to try to prevent this terrible, desperate solution. And yet it still happened all the same. I wonder how much suffering would have been averted had we done this earlier." Through his lone intact eye, Darkness of choice and destruction proclaimed, "Now you have taken your revenge, Salem. But before you revel, look out onto the ashes of this world and ask if it was worth it. I trust you will have a very long time to think about it." Salem fumed over their barely alive bodies, and electricity danced before her fingers. She then said, "Maybe, but at least you won't be thinking about anything at all." She prepared to finish them off. But before she could, 256 Vigilant Sensor finally returned, flanked by 2 sentinels that interrupted her. Just as Salem started to retaliate, effortlessly destroying the 2 sentinels, Sensor tapped into what remained of Remnant's teleportation grid and transported Salem back to Remnant's surface. Much to her and everyone else's horror, Salem had emerged onto a dead, lifeless world. Bodies were melting away before her very eyes, from the smallest blades of grass to the mightiest of beasts. Not a sound could be heard, and as shards of Remnant's broken moon rained around her, Salem fell to her knees and let out an anguished scream of rage. "Masters!" Sensor cried out as he scanned the brothers. "I need to get you to your cryptums." Darkness had now fallen into unconsciousness, but Light was forcing himself onto his feet and dragging himself to his terminal. Sensor protested, "Master, please, don't push yourself." I need to do this, Sensor," Light declared as he began typing instructions into his terminal. A readout of Remnant's systems were displayed, and Light winced both from pain and disappointment at the damage the artificial planet had suffered. "This isn't good. Nearly every system has suffered catastrophic damage. Let me tend to that. Maintaining this shield world is one of my primary duties," Sensor insisted as the monitor prepared to teleport both life workers to their cryptums. "No, not yet. Light insisted as he pulled up Remnant's genetic stocks. His frown deepened, and he winced before saying, "The human silexes, their DNA has been corrupted. There isn't enough to transport to Erdityrene. We can't even reseed Remnant with what we have." He racked his mind for a moment. Then darkness wheezed out, "The humans would splice animal DNA into their own. Use that?" "Yes. Yes, of course, brother," Light said as he did so. "I'll try to match the sequences as closely as possible. They won't be an exact match to Erdityrene's population, and some may exhibit traits of these animals, but they'll be close enough to interbreed with one another. It will work. They'll accept it, as they did before." As Light of Knowledge and Creation entered his last command, he fell unconscious. Sensor immediately used a soft anti-gravity beam to prevent him from falling to the ground and gently teleported both him and his brother out of the lab. They emerged near two identical spheres with glowing lines coming out from the base. One was glowing gold, while the other was dark purple. 256 Vigilant Sensor placed both Forerunners into what had to be their cryptums. Once secured, the chambers placed both Forerunners into stasis as they flew out from Remnant's atmosphere towards the outer edge of the ALM system. To shield themselves and their occupants, their artificial gravity picked up countless asteroids, coalescing around them and eventually forming two dwarf planets. The same planets that later came to be known as the Two Brothers, the first celestial bodies the UNSC discovered in the system. And so the Forerunners' dominance over the galaxy ended. Jin revealed as she showed the last of the Forerunners leave for Path Cathona, scuttling their ships and stranding themselves on a fertile world. Those who remained left the galaxy and their works behind on a great journey, abandoning their technology in favor of a primitive existence, living out the rest of their days and making no effort to reclaim their lost glory. Shame and regret had filled their souls, and they let their race fade away. "It's funny," Ashbin softly said as they watched the last of the Foreigners' numbers slowly, over the course of many years, dwindle one by one until none remained. "Despite everything they did, I can't help but feel sad about their fate." "I don't," Ironwood scoffed as he folded his arms over his chest. "After what we've just seen, they deserved what they got, whatever it was." "Maybe," Ashbin admitted, "but they seemed to recognize that, in the end, and at least tried to make amends." "That's admirable." John stayed silent as he pondered what he had just seen. His initial reaction was to agree with Ironwood's assessment. What the Forerunners did, to the ancestors, to Remnant, and to every species that went against their rule, told the Spartan that they needed to be knocked off their pedestal. There was also the simple fact that if the Forerunners were still around, humanity might not ever have had the chance to develop into what they were now. The galaxy as a whole was probably better off without them. At the same time, they didn't deserve extinction. No species did. Jin's story continued, returning to Remnant and showing Salem wandering a now-dead world. The genie said, "On Remnant, Salem was left all alone, banished from death. The brother's curse kept her alive, even as her body ached and hungered for sustenance that could not be met. As the years dragged on, every waking moment became utter agony. Not even her victory over the false gods who had wronged her could keep her going forever. Eventually, she sought an end to her existence." John watched as Salem committed suicide countless times. She stabbed herself through the heart, slit her wrists, threw herself into active volcanoes or down deep chasms. She sank to the bottom of the deepest oceans, allowing the intense pressure to crush her like a tin can. She locked herself in a cave and used her magic to induce a vacuum, suffocating herself and other various forms of death that John couldn't have even conceived of. But nothing worked. As a despondent Salem sat atop a flat rock, the only things that kept her company were the Grimm that were left behind. They now wandered the continents, with Salem uncaring of their presence. Without the Forerunners' control, these Grimm were much more aggressive, outright attacking Salem whenever they got too close. She'd let them maul her for a while, rip her flesh from her bones, but when that didn't kill her, she'd destroy them before moving on. It was a pathetic sight, and John could only feel pity. Seeking an end to her torturous existence, and driven to the edge of desperation, Salem did the one thing she could think of that might finally give her what she craved the most. Jin revealed as Salem returned to the land of darkness and stood before one of the pools of annihilation. She was clearly nervous, trickles of sweat beading down her brow as her disheveled hair billowed in the wind. Then, after taking a deep breath, she jumped from the ledge and plunged into the pool. She was wrong, Jin revealed while Salem's body twisted and turned as she was racked with agonizing pain. Her muffled screams only served to let more of the tar into her body, and John could see it eating away at her. At the same time, her body glowed as her immortality kept her alive until eventually she changed. A force of pure destruction could not destroy a being of infinite life. twisting and corrupting her into something new, something unexpected, a being of infinite life with an instinct for pure destruction. Jin revealed as a pale arm with black veins emerged from the pool. The girl in the tower was long gone. In her place was the Dark Queen of the Grim. Slowly but surely, Salem pulled herself from the pool, and despite himself, John felt his skin crawl as he looked upon her new form. Her corrupted beauty only served to make her new form more uncanny. Now, Salem looked like the unholy offspring of a human and a Grim. Her once blonde hair was now bone white, and her skin was a deathly pale. Her eyes were a blood red over a sea of black scara. And as she looked over her new form, those eyes were filled with a cold rage that drowned out her previous despair as Grim converged around her. Unlike before, they didn't move to attack. Instead, they started deferring to her. In time, Jin pivoted as Forerunner sentinels of various shapes and sizes returned to Remnant's surface from the garden. Life and humanity returned to Remnant. But the planet still bore the scars of Salem's rebellion, and humanity was not as it once was. They were weaker, without magic or aura, a pale imitation in Salem's eyes, and so she isolated herself from the world, refusing to associate herself with those she deemed inferior and sated in her belief that she at least achieved her revenge. But fate had other plans and a new adversary. Jin said as her story shifted to an endless white plan, where John saw Osma fade into existence. At first, the warrior was confused, looking around to see where he was, only to gasp as the Brother of Light's shining body hung over him. At first, the brother appeared as a golden, serpentine dragon, then transformed into a horned, humanoid shape. Osma, the Brother of Light, proclaimed, catching the warrior's undivided attention. "Where am I?" a confused and awestruck Osma asked his god, all while John asked himself how the brother was there at all if he was in stasis after Salem nearly killed him. Ashbin, meanwhile, was watching his past experience with a look of abject disappointment, almost anger. John didn't know if he was directing that to the Brother of Light or himself. "We are between realms," the Brother of Light revealed, a hint of sadness in his voice. "I'm afraid a tragedy has befallen your home. My brother and I have chosen to depart this world, but in our absence, I would like to offer you the chance to return to it." "I don't understand," Osma admitted. "What tragedy?" "Mankind is no more," the brother answered, causing Osma's eyes to widen in horror. "Yet your world remains. In time, your kind will grow to walk its face once again. But without our presence, they will be but a fraction of what they once were." The seemingly divine being spread his arms wide, conjuring 4 familiar objects, and declared, "Creation, destruction, choice, and knowledge were the ideals upon which humanity was made. We have left them behind with the hope that you will learn to reclaim yourselves. If brought together, these 4 relics will summon my brother and I back to your world, and humanity will be judged. If your kind has learned to live in harmony with one another, to set aside their differences, and truly become ready to accept the mantle of responsibility, humanity will be made whole. But if your kind is unchanged, if you continue to fight among yourselves and are unable to live up to the mantle, man will be found irredeemable, and your world will be wiped from existence." Osma's eyes widened as he was given this ultimatum, and he fell to his knees as the brother concluded, "Until your task is complete, you will reincarnate, but in a manner that ensures you will never be alone." Osma stared up at his god, and after a moment answered, "I'm sorry, but that world isn't as dear to me without her. If I may, I'd rather return to the domain to see Salem." "You will not find her there," the brother told him, and Osma shot to his feet. "You mean she isn't gone?" Osma asked incredulously, and John saw Ashbin mouth the word no silently. "Salem lives," the Brother of Light clarified, "but the woman you hold dear in your memories is gone. Heed this warning. Where you seek comfort, you will find only pain. So will you?" "I'll do it," Osma immediately answered, and the God of Light looked at the warrior in surprise. "You damn fool," Ashbin chastised, and John quickly glanced in his direction before returning his attention to the story. "Very well. Our creation rests within your hands," the God of Light proclaimed as the entire plane faded away in a bright flash. And so Osma was reborn. Jin revealed as she showed Osma reincarnating in a man with pale blonde hair and a tan complexion who had just stabbed a Beowulf with a pitchfork, but not into the world he was familiar with, nor a body that was his own. John and the others watched as Osma fought off the Grim, attacking him and the others around him with expert skill and precision, his eyes glowing a bright yellow. But once the fighting was over and Osma moved to assist the others, his eyes stopped glowing and his host threw his sword down in a panic. The Spartan immediately turned towards Ashbin, who sighed while closing his eyes. He remembered when Ashbin described how his reincarnation worked, and he realized what was going on. Only now did John truly understand the implications of what the infinite man meant, and as he watched the white-haired man stare despondently into an unfamiliar reflection, a profound, existential dread came over him. Eventually, after an unknown amount of time, they watched as Osma, now fully merged with his new host, walked down a street. Unlike the civilization he previously lived in, this new remnant was tighter, dirtier, and harsher. He saw faunus locked in cages, sold as slaves and commodities alongside raw dust crystals piled on top of each other. The world Osma found himself in was alien, filled with both humans and creatures called faunus who bore fangs and claws, for which they were locked away in cages like animals. Jin explained as Osma looked upon the caged faunus in sad confusion before reluctantly turning away. Worst of all, none could perform the magic that mankind was once capable of. None except for himself and a woman known as the witch. They watched as Osma trekked into a forest, where they saw a dilapidated cottage in the woods. Jin continued. During his years of travel, Osma had heard frightened whispers that spoke of a terrifying sorceress who commanded dark powers in the wilds among the beasts and monsters. He was convinced that this, which was Salem, and against the god of light's warnings, he decided that he needed to know what had become of her. "You didn't," Theodore chastised. "I did," Ashbin admitted as they watched Osma walk up to the door of the cottage. "The first of many mistakes I've come to regret." Before Osma could open the door, it was flung open by a powerful wind, from which Salem, now wearing a black dress and with her hair neatly tidied up, stormed outward, ready to destroy whoever trespassed on her home. Magic was already pulsating in her hands, but she stopped as she and Osma locked their eyes. "Call it magic or call it something stronger," Jin said as Salem's prepared spell dissipated, and both she and Osma's arms fell to their sides. But in that moment, the two knew exactly who it was that stood before them. Slowly but surely, the reunited lovers grew closer, each unsure that what they were seeing was real. When they locked hands, they both laughed in joyous surprise, then embraced tightly. "What do we do now?" Osma happily asked the love of his life. "Whatever we like," she just as happily answered. The seasons passed, and the broken cottage was rebuilt, filled with new life. As the two lovers ate together at a table, talking and laughing with each other, Jin continued her story and revealed, as they recounted the events which had finally, after so long, brought them back together, each withheld parts of their story. Salem, fearing Osma would reject her, blamed the end of the world and her present state on the gods. Osma, still unsure of where the truth lay, kept his task and the relics a secret. Yet, even at this early stage, the seeds of disaster were planted. "You say the brother of light brought you back to life?" Salem asked in surprise, and Osma nodded. "Yes, he did," Osma confirmed. "I don't know why he chose me, but since it brought me back to you, I'm grateful." "But that's impossible," Salem insisted. "The gods weren't gods, Osma. They were something else. Beings from another world entirely. They did this to me. They destroyed the world. It's why I had to kill them." Rather than take his wife at her word, Osma looked at her in confusion, then said, "I know, but that doesn't make any sense. If you killed the god of light and his brother, then how could he have brought me out of the afterlife?" Salem sputtered, and Osma gently put his hands on hers. "Salem, how long has it been since that day?" Salem was silent as she racked her brain, then softly answered, "Osma, I don't know. I've lost count. Millennia, at least." "Ah, I see," Osma gently replied. "The passage of time has not been kind to you, my love. Memories fade, twist, and converge with time, and no one is immune to it. Not even you, sadly. I'm amazed you still remember me. Thousands of years for you have been mere moments for me, so I remember our past life far more clearly. I don't believe the beings you faced were actually the gods, and they still exist." Osma meant for his words to comfort Salem. Jin explained as Osma hugged his wife, who stared deeply and blankly into the wall behind him as she sank her fingers into his shoulders, a terrified look on her face. But they instead had the opposite effect. For the first time in millennia, Salem now faced the very real prospect that her hard-won revenge, her only source of satisfaction and contentment, was entirely for naught. Her already damaged mind began to fray. John glanced towards Ashbin, who was looking at his past incarnation in newfound horror. The headmaster asked himself, "What have I done?" The others turned towards the despondent headmaster while Jin continued her tale, showing Salem and Ashbin coming to the decision to unite humanity themselves after gentle prodding by the immortal witch, using their magic to become Remnant's king and queen. Ashbin ignored all of it and muttered, "It's my fault. It's all my fault." "From what I saw," Lord Hood softly said after a moment, seemingly understanding what Ashbin was talking about. "Her mind was already broken." "Maybe," Ashbin reluctantly admitted, "but I certainly didn't help." Salem and Osma's kingdom began to spread across Remnant. Osma, their heroic king, and Salem, his ash bride. Jin explained as she showed their capital, centered around a massive castle that reminded John of Beacon Academy in design. Inside, he saw Osma and Salem, now wearing elaborate royal robes, joined by 4 young girls with blonde hair. Their children, he realized. More importantly, he saw the royals spreading their dominion far and wide, absorbing everyone they encountered into their borders. They could see Osma using diplomacy, trying to foster peace and understanding, whereas Salem would all too gleefully throw armies of men and grim at those who would not submit. At first, Osma seemed to try to ignore his wife's destructive tendencies, but over time his discontent and disgust at their actions grew. "Are we sure this is right?" Osma asked Salem as he stood near the throne room window, Salem beside him. "You said we needed to bring humanity together," she pointed out. "That's what we're doing. In order to do that, my love, we have to spread our word and destroy those who deny it." Osma looked at his wife in shock and horror, then turned back towards the window where he saw his reflection staring at him. The reflection suddenly asked, "What are we doing?" Osma's body reeled back in surprise, shaken by the voice from his subconscious. When he recovered, he looked aside and muttered under his breath, "This isn't what he asked of me." "What did you say?" Salem asked, raising her eyebrow in suspicion. But before Osma could say anything, the door to the throne room opened as their eldest daughter ran in with a wide smile on her face. "Mother, father, look," she called out as she conjured multicolored wisps of magic. Both parents looked on in amazement, and Salem proudly smiled at her daughter. Osma, meanwhile, could only stare incredulously, then gazed at his feet with a troubled expression. "It was a miracle," Jin explained. "Their children could perform magic just as their ancestors once could. But what should have been a joyous occasion was short-lived." The scene shifted, and they watched as Osma explained the truth of his resurrection to Salem, about why the Brother of Light chose him, of the task he was assigned, and the tools needed to do so. When he was done, the spouses sat silently at their table, and Osma looked at his wife nervously. After a few moments, Salem began to chuckle. Rather than reassure Osma, the sound only made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, and his trepidation only grew when Salem replied, "Osma, don't you see? None of that matters anymore. Why spend our lives trying to redeem these humans when we can replace them with what they can never be?" John's brow furrowed as he understood what Salem was implying while she held out her hand towards Osma. The ancient king recognized it as well, and he backed away in disgust. Salem wasn't just talking about repopulating Remnant. She was talking about cleansing the world to make room for their replacements, about genocide. Not only that, but the analytical part of John's mind, drilled into him thanks to Halsey's extensive education, told him that repopulating Remnant with humans capable of magic meant that Salem would have to keep at least some native humans alive purely to breed. Only 6 people in the world had been capable of performing magic, all of them related to one another. It wasn't enough to repopulate on their own. That mindset might even extend to her own daughters, forcing or manipulating them to pump out child after child. The scene progressed to that night, and John watched as Osma quietly attempted to escort his scared and confused daughters through the castle halls. Jin didn't need to say what was going on for John and the others to understand. Osma had come to realize that Salem's intentions were no longer pure, if they ever were, and he was trying to save his children. But then the youngest daughter stopped as she noticed a furious Salem standing at the end of the hall, her eyes burning red. Osma protectively stepped in front of his daughters. Then Salem roared as she attacked with brute force. Osma immediately countered with expert precision, and the once lovers began a furious battle that reduced their once grand castle to rubble. When the fighting was over, John saw Osma pulling his broken, bleeding body along the ground toward the charred plush toy, its former owner nowhere to be seen. Behind him, a pile of ash reformed, and a furious Salem approached, then kicked her husband onto his back. "We finally had freedom," Salem hissed as she snarled at a bloody, bleeding Osma. "We were finally together, and you chose them." Osma looked weakly up at her, then tried to say something. But before he could, Salem blasted his body with searing flames, killing him once more. As she stood over the remains, Salem looked out over their kingdom as the shattered moon rose overhead. The people in the city had no idea what was going on, nor what had happened, and many were now venturing outside of their homes to try and find out. Salem did nothing at first, merely looked at Osma's charred corpse. Then the loud cries and roars of Grimm echoed across the land, and Salem simply pointed her arm forward, beckoning them to attack and slaughter everyone. "Jesus Christ," Lord Hood muttered as they watched the slaughter and the destruction of their entire empire, reducing humanity to a primitive state yet again. Why? Why would she do this? It makes no sense." "The same as before," Ashbin quietly answered. Revenge, this time against me. You chose humanity over her, and she couldn't accept that, John added, and Ashbin nodded. Yes, he confirmed, but I suspect that has since only become an added bonus. She wants me to suffer, true, but her true desire is the same, an end. Of course, Adler remarked. It makes sense now. Spreading strife, sowing discord. It's all meant to keep humanity divided and at each other's throats. All while she tries to get the relics. She's not trying to remake the world in her image. She's trying to end it, Ashbin answered. She believes that if she keeps humanity divided and brings all 4 relics together, summoning the brothers back, they'll destroy humanity again with her alongside them. A murder-suicide, Theodore mused. On a scale I couldn't even imagine. Indeed, Ashbin stated, and he returned his attention to Jin's story as she showed the Infinite Man in a new body, now surrounded by a group of followers. Osma, now committed to stopping Salem, knew that humanity in its present state could not protect itself from the now unleashed Grimm. They weren't strong enough, Jin revealed, showing scenes of Osma valiantly defending entire settlements from the Grimm, his supporters doing what they could but to little effect. He could train others to fight like he could, but they could never wield magic nor aura. Jin told them as Osma searched the land over the course of many lifetimes, eventually finding a lost entrance from a time long forgotten. Thankfully, he knew where to look and what to find. Bidding his followers farewell, Osma descended into the cave, which eventually shifted from rock to metal, from sharp and rough edges to smooth and polished surfaces. As Osma traveled deeper into the planet, Jin told them, Remnant still bore the scars from Salem's rebellion, even after thousands of years of constant repair and maintenance. It took all of the Monitor's attention simply to keep the planet turning. He would fix one problem, only for 2 more to take its place. Despite the damage, and through countless struggles, Ashbin found what he was searching for, the garden. Emerging from the mouth of the cave-in with a much more ragged and disheveled appearance, they watched as Osma walked out into the inner sanctum of Remnant. The garden, even after all that time, was still peaceful and serene, allowing Osma unfettered access. Guided by Salem's story, he made his way towards the brothers' lab. When he arrived, much to John's surprise, the structure was now completely intact. Using his magic, Osma was able to easily force his way in and descended deep into the lab's depths. At the center, suspended over a seemingly endless chasm and surrounded by what looked like water, was the paracausality inducer. Using the apple, Jin explained as Osma grabbed the inducer and made his way back onto Remnant's surface. Osma bestowed humanity the gift of aura. The power may only have been a semblance of what he could wield, and using the apple was dangerous, but he hoped it would be enough. Starting with his most loyal followers, aura spread around the world like a cascade, passed on by direct benediction and from their offspring. Humans, faunus, animals, even plants. In time, all creatures on Remnant would be able to use this power to defend themselves. But he couldn't keep the apple forever, and it wasn't long before its caretaker returned for it. Jin pointed out as a now much older Osma, sitting in a cottage, was suddenly met by 256 vigilant sensor teleporting in front of him. The monitor looked the same as it did during the time of the Forerunners, but somehow seemed angrier, more resentful. Osma looked at the construct in surprise, but before he could say or do anything, the monitor smote him with a powerful laser that reduced his body to atoms. Reclaimers, Sensor disdainfully spat as he recovered the apple. Always breaking things. With that, Sensor teleported away, and the entrance Osma used to access the garden was sealed shut. The story faded back into white, and once again John found himself in an endless desert. Jin was now fully visible, here tail complete, and she looked upon them all with a satisfied smirk on her face. I hope that answered your question, Catherine, she goaded, then looked at the others. Now, then, do any of you have another question for me? Tilda. Everyone was quiet for a while. None of them knew what to say, not even Ashbin. He had expected to learn much from Jin's story, as was always the case whenever he came to her for answers. Whether it was good or bad information was irrelevant. But never in his wildest dreams did he believe that the answer to the question, why are the people of Earth and Remnant so similar yet different to one another, would have resulted in this. Remnant being a completely artificial world. Humanity being the creation of godlike alien beings. 2 of said aliens being the original 2 brothers whom he and his people worshipped. Humanity once having a civilization that spanned the stars alongside both ancient members of the Covenant and their interstellar cousins, the Forerunners. The fact that the Forerunners devolved humanity into a primitive state, and 2 of them stole the identities of to be the 2 brothers simply to conduct experiments on the people of Remnant and everything else. It utterly boggled his mind. Well, Lord Hood finally spoke up, breaking the silence. That was a lot to take in. The Admiral's words brought Ashbin back to the present, and he nodded before saying, "Give us a few minutes, Jin. We need time to process." "Of course." Jin agreed with a shrug as she twirled about in the air. "It's not like time has any meaning right now." "She means that literally," Ashbin absent-mindedly pointed out. Whenever Jin is called, the world outside of the immediate area around her freezes in time. Halsey sighed in resignation as she pinched her nose to try and soothe a migraine before muttering, "Of course that's what happens. Can't say I'm surprised anymore." She then shook her head and straightened herself before turning to Lord Hood and saying, "I must admit, when I asked that question, I expected Forerunner involvement on Remnant. Everything else caught me completely off guard." "I think that's putting it lightly, Doctor," Agent Adler remarked as he pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and drew in a puff of smoke. "It looked to me like all people of Remnant are, in some way, faunus," Glinda pointed out, and Halsey nodded. "It looked that way to me, too. But I doubt people will care, especially those who benefit from pushing racial strife," Halsey pointed out, and Ashbin frowned, knowing she was right. "I'll inform HICOM personally when I report back to Reach. Can't risk a leak, not of something of this magnitude," Hood declared as he craned his neck back, took off his hat, then ran his hand through his balding hair. Putting his hat back on, he added, "So, those are the Forerunners. Real pieces of work. And our genetic cousins, apparently," Halsey remarked as she pinched her chin in thought, her scientific mind racing through the implications. She began to pace around, raising her finger into the air as though to help concentrate whatever point she was trying to make, then mused, "Based on Jin's story, Earth is our species' homeworld. Not only of humanity, but, in a roundabout way, the Forerunners as well. Without actual samples to conduct tests on, I'm reluctant to declare Forerunners a species of hominid, but we're definitely related. Probably not to the extent of, say, Homo sapiens to Homo neanderthalensis, but perhaps Homo sapiens to pan-troglodytes. Chimpanzees," John, 117 clarified to the others in the room. "Our closest genetic relative. At least until now, possibly." "Indeed," Halsey said, then shrugged. "Or maybe they are actual hominids, separated from our own species by thousands of light years and millions of years of divergent evolution. At the moment, I don't have the answers, but I can admit that I'm excited to dig up the truth. Quite literally in this case." She turned to Agent Adler and declared, "I'll be requesting increased funds from the Office of Naval Intelligence for xenoarchaeology digs." "As will I," Adler agreed, drawing in another puff from his cigarette. "I imagine they'll be highly interested in uncovering any remains from our past civilization. Hard to believe that was actually a thing, but if we can recover any of our lost technology, I won't care, and we'll just appreciate the poetry as we use it against the Covenant." "Remind me of the stories of Atlantis I grew up with as a kid," Hood remarked. "Many legends begin from fact," Ashbin pointed out, but Halsey scoffed. "Plato wrote Atlantis as a political allegory on the hubris of nations and an example of his idealized society," Halsey said. "It was never based on anything historical." "That may have been his direct framework, yes," Ashbin acquiesced. "But the concept of an ancient, advanced civilization that surpassed contemporary societies before disappearing under calamitous events is a tale as old as time. I suspect cultural memories and oral traditions of our ancestors, in one way or another, inspired the stories that came next. Believe me, I have plenty of first-hand experience in that regard." "That's putting it lightly," Ironwood scoffed before briefly glaring at Ashbin. Ashbin steadfastly met his gaze, and after a moment the Atlesian general turned away. Ashbin took a moment to look at the rest of his inner circle, trying to gauge their thoughts. All of them were disillusioned, but to varying degrees. Glinda appeared to be the most sympathetic, followed by Theodore. Ironwood was angry, his fist clenched tighter than before and occasionally glancing at Beacon's headmaster. But he wasn't pressing it, especially with his fellow military men from the UNSC being so open and accepting. Ashbin was still astounded by that. While the UNSC was understandably upset that his secrets indirectly contributed to the grim tide, which he wouldn't blame them for, beyond that they were the most accepting of his history in the entire room. Especially ONI, which made him more uncomfortable than the disappointed glances his friends and colleagues were giving him combined. Crow, however, was easily the worst. The man was distraught, now draining his flask and refusing to look at Ashbin. Frowning to himself, Ashbin spoke up, "Crow, Not now, Ashbin. I don't want to hear it." Crow interrupted, refusing to meet his gaze with his own. Ashbin's frown deepened. Then he sighed and turned away. Clearly the bonds he had forged had frayed considerably thanks to Jin's revelations. He would have to repair them, not only because the fate of Remnant itself depended on him and his allies being able to work together, but, just as importantly, because they were his friends. Ashbin had never intended to hurt them. His intentions had always been pure, and his justifications had made sense at the time. But he supposed that line of thinking was what caused this to happen in the first place. Yet another mistake to add to his ever-growing pile. Thankfully, he got the sense that these connections, while frayed, weren't completely severed. They could possibly be repaired, but it would take time. As he looked at Crow once again, he knew some of them would take longer than others. Theodore then spoke up and offered, "I'm sorry you had to live through that again, Ashbin." He'd been trying to ignore that, but Theodore's apology brought it back to the front of his mind. A storm of emotions were welling up from within. Anger, grief, humiliation. His life and history with Salem, more than any other secret, was never meant to be shared. Especially not like this, having it projected and shown to others like they were in a theater watching a play. Part of him wanted to simply curl up in a ball and shut himself out from the world, or at least rant to Jen about how she could possibly think that was relevant to Halsey's question. But he knew that wasn't an option, and he'd already spent enough lifetimes hiding himself away. So he pressed forward. "It's fine," he finally said after a few moments. "But we have more important things to discuss." "Yes, like the location of that paracausality inducer," Halsey agreed, focusing on their original objective. "Don't you mean the apple?" Crow drunkenly remarked, and Halsey simply glared at him. "I refuse to call it that," Halsey insisted. "Just as I refuse to call paracausality magic." "Already using Forerunner terms, I see." "Yes, because it applies." "You just don't want to call it what it is," Crow chuckled. "It's aura and magic." "I think you mean neural physics," Halsey replied, but before Crow could stubbornly continue the debate, Lord Hood interjected. "I don't care what it's called. The apple, the inducer, the magic ball. The name isn't important," Hood pointed out. "What's important is what it does. If we can find and recover the apple, we can start giving our soldiers aura. That'll be a game changer. At least until you learn the technique of awakening another's aura," Ashbin added. "When I used the apple, those techniques increased the speed with which aura spread across Remnant's people exponentially." "Remnant is just one planet," Adla pointed out. "How long did that take?" "Lifetimes," Ashbin simply answered, and he involuntarily shuddered at the memory. Spreading the use of aura across Remnant following its reseeding was the most complicated project he and his generations of followers had ever attempted, and they had the benefit of Remnant's people having always concentrated into relatively few places. He didn't even want to think about how long it would take to spread aura across all of human space. "Which makes it all the more important to find it as soon as possible," Hood said, and the Master Chief nodded. "Before you ask Jin the location of the inducer, Admiral," Halsey spoke up as she pointed to Professor Ashbin, "remember that we have a lead to its general location right here." Hood didn't say anything at first, but judging by how he started to awkwardly rub the back of his head, Ashbin got the sense that he at least had the inclination to ask that question. Nodding towards the scientist, Ashbin admitted, "The entrance I used to get into the garden all those lifetimes ago has been closed, as were the others. Undoubtedly, the work of that monitor, 256 vigilance sensor. Honestly, the more I look at it, the more I'm ashamed I didn't catch on to their true nature earlier. They pulled the wool over your eyes for your planet's entire history," Adla pointed out. "At least you accept the truth when given. I doubt the Covenant would do the same." "I've seen Sensor," John declared, drawing everyone's attention save for Crow, who was shaking out the last drops from his flask. "In Mountain Glen, an unidentified object that looked exactly like Sensor was watching over the battle as we were finishing the evacuation. Sierra 058 spotted it first, then it teleported away. I think it noticed us." "Yep, was really, really far away, so we couldn't get a good look at it," Crow agreed with a slight slur. "But that's what was over in Mountain Glen. Looked like a metal, floating eyeball." "That might mean there could be an entrance under Mountain Glen," Adler suggested. "I'll direct survey teams to the area once the Grimtide fully dies down. After that, judging by what you went through the last time you went down there, Headmaster, I imagine it will be yours and Admiral Hood's responsibility." Jin didn't show us what happened, John noted as he looked towards Beacon's headmaster. His question went unsaid, but it was understood regardless. "It's been thousands of years, so things may have changed," Ashbin admitted. "But when I was down there, it was nothing short of chaos. Grim, out of control, endless armies of sentinels just holding the line against them. It took everything I had to fight and sneak my way through it, and it still almost killed me." Everyone was silent as they absorbed Ashbin's warning. Then the Master Chief nodded in acceptance. "Two endless armies of grim and alien robots duking it out in a forever war underground," Theodore sarcastically remarked. "Sounds like fun." "Fun isn't the word I would use for it," Glinda said. "Yeah, sounds like it'll be a blast," Crow drunkenly agreed, the sudden intake of alcohol already getting to him. "So, this mantle of responsibility, bullshit. The Forerunners kicked our asses over it, turned us back into cavemen, turned us into guinea pigs, then decided they felt bad and gave it to us." "That's a rough summary of it," Ironwood remarked. "It sounds to me like humanity was given a manifest destiny over the entire galaxy." Many of the others in the room nodded in agreement, with Adler more enthusiastic about it than the others, but Ashbin and Halsey merely frowned, while Hood just looked conflicted. Before Ashbin could say anything, the Master Chief spoke up and remarked, "I believe that is the exact same trap the Forerunners fell into. I don't know what the Precursors meant for the mantle, but it is clear that the Forerunners treated it as an imperial piece. Step out of line and suffer. It led them into wars and created enemies that weren't needed, until eventually they found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't defeat in a war that destroyed everything." Everyone was silent at that, and Ashbin looked upon the Spartan in surprise, while Halsey simply nodded in satisfaction. He had thought that the UNSC's top secret super soldier would be all over the idea of human supremacy over the galaxy, especially with the Covenant trying to destroy them. Humanity indisputably being the dominant power in the galaxy would, at the very least, ensure their protection, if nothing else. Ashbin felt his respect for the Spartan rise after he pointed out the same cautionary tale Ashbin had noticed. After a moment, Hood nodded in agreement, raising Ashbin's estimation of the Admiral as well, whereas Adler looked dismissive. "That sounds about right," Hood admitted after a moment, then shook his head. "Still, I can't believe that a disease of all things destroyed the ancestors, and probably the Forerunners too. Outbreaks of disease have collapsed countless civilizations across human history," Halsey pointed out. "We even experienced a few cross-colony pandemics when the outer colonies were being established and controls were loosened. Open warfare only makes it worse as infrastructure gets destroyed and overwhelmed, all while refugees flee to safe harbor. More than a few outbreaks have started because of insurrectionists and vaccine skepticism, to say nothing of our war against the Covenant, so I'm not surprised it happened to them. What confuses me is why they seem to be throwing armies and fleets at whatever this parasite was, and were willing to burn entire worlds just to contain it. They seem to be treating it like a war, not a pandemic. Maybe it was a precursor bioweapon," Ironwood suggested. "Jin did say that we dug around places that should have been left buried. Could have found something paracausal, and it got loose. A bioweapon is probably the only type of disease that could break down an interstellar civilization of that size, scale, and sophistication," Halsey agreed. "But I still have no idea what kind of bioweapon it was, and why it required both the ancestors and the Forerunners to treat it like an opposing military. It's odd and concerning. If we had another spare question, I'd ask. But right now, it's irrelevant to what we're dealing with." Iapin agreed with Halsey's point. "The fact is, whatever this bioweapon was, it ransacked the galaxy 100,000 years ago and destroyed the Forerunners. While that was definitely concerning, it wasn't affecting them now. The Forerunners must have done something to deal with it. Perhaps that's what the conservation measure was. If only to satiate his own curiosity, Ashbin wanted to ask for specifics, especially since Jin definitely knew what it was, and it seemed to scare her. But he bit his tongue and decided he could worry about ancient pandemics later. "One thing still confuses me, though," Glinda admitted. "Salem killed the brothers, yet the Brother of Light somehow and for some reason resurrected you." Truth be told, Ashbin didn't have an answer for that. He was still recovering from the revelation that the gods he worshipped were complete frauds, just like Salem told him all those years ago. But before he could voice that, John suddenly spoke up. "I'm not entirely certain that the being who experimented on Osma and the being who resurrected him were the same." "What do you mean, John?" Ashbin asked, using the Spartan's name so that Jin knew he wasn't asking her. "When the Forerunners committed genocide on the Precursors," John began, "the Precursors you call the two brothers, the ones who created humanity, and by extension, the Forerunners, escaped to a parallel reality," Jin called it. "They never died, meaning they could still exist. They can still interact with the world, and that possibly includes you." Ashbin's eyes widened, and the Master Chief continued. "What's more, I question the relationship between the four relics and the apple. They look remarkably different from one another, and the Lifeworkers mentioned excavations into our ancient ruins when the Master Builder first saw them. I don't believe the relics are Forerunner in origin, which could mean that they're either ancestor or precursor." Once more, Ashbin found his world turned upside down. Perhaps it was because he was simply too close to the situation, but now that the Spartan brought it up, he couldn't ignore it. The discrepancy was staring at him in the face. He wanted to know the truth. He needed to know the truth. Was the Brother of Light who resurrected him the same one who cursed Salem with immortality? Were the relics themselves the product of Forerunner science or precursor neural physics? He looked up at Jin, who stared knowingly right back. All he had to do was say one sentence, ask one question, and Jin would give him all the answers he suddenly needed. Iapin desperately wanted to ask it, more than any other question he had ever asked before in his many, many lifetimes. But he bit his tongue. He wasn't so selfish as to waste the last question on something that pertained only to him, especially not now. He could wait until the next century if they survived that long. It wasn't as though he didn't have the time. I believe I've given you all enough time to process. Jin impatiently spoke up, cutting through the conversation. Now, do any of you have another question for me? No one said anything. Instead, most of them looked at Ashbin. They obviously remembered his warning against asking Jin how to defeat the Covenant. They may have dismissed it earlier, but after seeing how Jin answered their question and the truth of Salem's entire existence, the question suddenly had that much more weight. Yet at the same time, they couldn't just not ask it. He didn't know what to say. Well, I'm waiting, Jin said, this time much more impatiently. Still, none of them said anything. That was when John asked, how do we win the war? Ashbin shot his head towards the Master Chief, who was staring right into Jin's eyes as she smiled at the Spartan. Without looking at the others, John seemed to recognize that they were staring at him, and he remarked, winning the war doesn't require defeating the Covenant. Winning the war simply means humanity gets to survive. Defeating the Covenant was simply a means to an end, not what we are fighting for in and of itself. Slowly, Ashbin and the others turned towards Jin, who loomed larger in preparation of her answer, and his heart jumped into his throat when Jin answered, you can't. A heavy weight seemed to press on Ashbin's chest, as it did with everyone else save for the ever-stoic Spartan. Then Jin smirked and added, not alone. Hood let out an audible sigh of relief as Jin started twirling her hands about, conjuring an image of the Milky Way galaxy before focusing on the Orion arm. Hundreds of star systems glowed a bright blue, and Jin remarked, this is human space at your height before the Covenant began their invasion. It is tight and dense, consisting of hundreds of colonies of different shapes and sizes across hundreds of star systems over the course of hundreds of years of space exploration. She then zoomed outward, and a sea of purple emerged that made Ashbin's eyes bulge out of his skull as Jin revealed, this is Covenant space. It is a vast, labyrinthine network consisting of thousands of worlds and thousands of systems colonized over thousands of years with dozens of different species, all united under High Charity's banner. A massive space station, formed out of what appeared to be a giant chunk of a planet's crust or a large asteroid, was shown, surrounded by the single largest Covenant fleet any of them had seen. Hood remarked, oh my God, this is High Charity, Jin revealed, the industrial, economic, social, and political heart of the Covenant's vast and growing empire. Tides from thousands of worlds flow through its ports, where the hierarchs direct the entire Covenant as they walk along the path of their gods towards the great journey. Jin stared hard at the Master Chief, who met her stare with his own as she laid out. The Covenant outnumber humanity. The Covenant can outproduce humanity. Any losses, no matter how great, can and will be replaced, whereas humanity cannot say the same. The Covenant are more technologically advanced than humanity, negating your own advantages. For most of the Covenant, humanity is a mere afterthought, its destruction relegated to the Ministry of Resolution, a formerly minor ministry previously tasked with countering piracy before its elevation by the current hierarchs of truth, mercy, and regret. We've been getting our asses kicked by the goddamn Coast Guard, Hood muttered under his breath. In short, John, it is impossible for humanity to defeat the Covenant through battle alone, Jin declared, and once again Ashbin feared that Jin's answer would only result in ruin for those who heard it. Then Jin smiled and said, but despite its vast power, the Covenant is not as monolithic as it appears. The scene shifted, and they watched large groups of prophets worshipping at the feet of a massive Forerunner vessel, with a priest leading the sermon. Jin declared, before the dawn of the Covenant, the Sanchon lived on their homeworld of Jandracom. On it were the remains of the Forerunners, relics from a bygone age. Having forgotten their history, they believed the Forerunners had become gods when they left the galaxy on their great journey, leaving their artifacts behind. Eventually, however, conflict arose over what to do with these artifacts, particularly a crashed Forerunner keyship called the Anodyne Spirit. Jin continued as they watched groups of prophets begin vigorous, often violent debates. The vast majority of Sanchon, the Stoics, believed that attempting to tamper with or directly study Forerunner artifacts was heretical. A minority, the Reformists, believed otherwise. They believed that entering the Dreadnought, exploring its interior and learning how it worked would both lead to immense technological progress and bring them closer to their gods. The scene shifted, and the area around the Forerunner Dreadnought was suddenly consumed by armed conflict as the Stoics and Reformists fought each other. Jin announced, the War of Wills. In many ways, the Covenant was born during this long, bloody conflict. A conflict that ended when a small group of 1,000 Reformists broke inside and, after many years of work, managed to reawaken the slumbering beast. The Dreadnought's engines ignited, allowing the vessel to leave Jandracom behind, taking with it a massive chunk of the planet's crust. Although the Stoics cursed the Reformists, they weren't willing to destroy the sacred vessel and allowed it to leave. For over 1,000 years, the reformists wandered the stars, searching for Forerunner reliquaries on abandoned worlds and derelict stations, guided by a luminary, Jin said as they watched the anodyne spirit travel from world to world. But although they had gotten what they wanted, it came at a cost. Their number on board the dreadnought was too small for a viable population, forcing harsh restrictions to prevent inbreeding. They watched as the prophets' bodies, over the course of centuries, started to degrade towards a more familiar, feeble state. They were still able to walk around on their own power, but they weren't as healthy-looking as they were before. Eventually, Jin narrated as she showed the dreadnought land on a rocky world, the prophets discovered the world of Uljathon. As with many worlds, it too had Forerunner relics on its surface. But, unlike the others, Uljathon was not abandoned, for it had been found earlier by another species. The scene zoomed back, revealing an elite holding a metal sword in his hand. He, along with several others carrying rifles and swords, watched the prophets as they disembarked from their vessel towards the Forerunner sites, and the elite snarled. Like the Santum, the Sangheili worshipped the Forerunners as their gods, Jin said. And like the Stoics, they believed that tampering directly with Forerunner devices was heresy. So, when the Sangheili discovered what the reformists intended, they struck first. The Sangheili party ambushed the prophets, mercilessly slaughtering them. They then chopped off their heads, causing Ashbin to glance down towards Spring, who was now sealing her eyes shut and covering her ears as best she could while she shook fearfully. When he looked back up, the rest of the prophets had received the severed heads as a warning, and in horror they fled up into orbit where they were attacked by a Sangheili fleet. Ashbin couldn't help but notice that the Sangheili's technology was remarkably similar to what the UNSC used today. Thus was waged the War of Beginnings, where the Sansham fought from within their impenetrable dreadnought to raise Sangheili worlds, slaughtering millions. Jin revealed as they watched dozens of worlds, including Uljathon, be scorched under the dreadnought's power. But the Sangheili were capable warriors and managed to breach the dreadnought's defenses. Jin revealed as an elite boarding party managed to bore their way into the anodyne spirit, where they proceeded to slaughter thousands of prophets before getting put down themselves. Eventually, with annihilation on the horizon, the Sangheili began to tap into their own reserve of Forerunner artifacts. Jin declared as the Sangheili proceeded to do as she said, creating new weapons and vessels armed with Forerunner weaponry powerful enough to damage the dreadnought directly. Realizing that their security within the dreadnought was no longer guaranteed, and seeing that the Sangheili were amenable to using Forerunner technology for their own use, a truce was eventually reached. In time, this truce became an alliance, solidified by the writ of union. Jin declared as she showed a column of Sangheili kneeling before a trio of prophets. The covenant was born. When the covenant was established, Jin continued, the Sansham and the Sangheili were given equal yet distinct roles in their new society. The Sansham were to be the covenant's religious leaders, studying Forerunner technology and leading the search to begin the great journey they promised. The Sangheili were to be their protectors, using the weapons and technology developed by their partners to push the covenant forward. Initially, this alliance was one of equals. In time, they began to find new races. Most were encountered violently. Jin said as she showed the covenant wage war against what had to be the Lekalo after the still primitive worms apparently ate a Forerunner installation. But, at the same time, much to the Sinsham's frustration, the Sangheili were willing to open a hand to those who'd earned their respect, much as when they invited the Lekalo to join their covenant rather than eradicate them as the Sansham desired. Ashbin and the others quietly looked at each other, with Crow muttering under his breath. What do the worms got that we don't? Over thousands of years, Jin continued, the covenant expanded their reach across the galaxy in search of Forerunner relics. With each found, their strength and power grew. Additionally, they encountered new species. Most were subsumed, relegated as fringe species as they weren't valuable enough for full membership. Others were eradicated, unable to resist the covenant's might as they took what they desired. A rare few were invited, forming distinct castes within their burgeoning society. Jin told them as she showed a map of the galaxy, with more and more stars turning purple. The location of covenant homeworlds were highlighted, and Jin listed off. From Sangelios came the Sangheili. From the moons of Te, the Lekalo. From the jungles of Palamuk, the Yanmei. From the seas of Een, the Kigyar. From the frigid tundras of Balaho came the methane-breathing Ungoi, and from the rugged wastelands of Doisak came the brutish Jirulhani. Much to their alarm, Ashbin and the others noticed that Een was uncomfortably close to Earth, a mere 41 light-years away. How the Covenant never noticed that was beyond him, but he was simply grateful that they clearly hadn't. But these conquests were never peaceful, and with each passing century, the rot within the Covenant grew. Jin explained as she showed the different races living on high charity. Or rather, from Ashbin's observations, barely tolerating each other's presence. From their positions atop the Covenant hierarchy, both the Sanchum and the Sangaili cared little for the affairs of those beneath them. They were simply tools to be used in pursuit of the great journey and the betterment of the Covenant. None had it worse than the Ungoi, the lowest rate in their society. Small, diminutive, and rapacious breeders, the Ungoi were the grunts of Covenant society, performing the tasks that the rest had no desire to do themselves. She showed scenes of the Ungoi getting pushed around and abused by other species of the Covenant, hurled into battle without weapons or armor, and deaf to the losses the grunt suffered. It was an upsetting, pitiful sight, and Ashbin couldn't help but frown sympathetically. Adler, meanwhile, looked like he was mentally taking notes. Their rivalry with the Kigyar was especially brutal. Both were at the bottom of Covenant society, and the Kigyar liked to reinforce the Ungoi's place beneath them. It was a rivalry the Covenant leadership ignored. Some even encouraged it, as it prevented both species from turning their attention onto those above them. But eventually, the Ungoi had enough, and launched a rebellion so vast and so violent that it threatened to tear the entire Covenant apart. High Charity was now completely consumed by warfare, with elite warriors leading hunters and some jackals in fending off the grunts. There were hundreds of thousands of them, completely outnumbering the soldiers as the grunts, using stolen Covenant weaponry, killed everyone in sight. Eventually, the grunts were forced to surrender when a Sangaili warrior, clad in distinctive silver armor, partially glassed Balaho. But rather than punish the grunts further, the same Sangaili warrior opened his hand to give a defeated Ungoi a plasma pistol. The scene shifted, and the grunts were now going into combat with weapons and armor. It was clear that they were still at the bottom of Covenant society, and they occasionally saw scenes of smaller-scale grunt rebellions, but it was evident that their lot had somewhat improved. A similar rivalry emerged between the Sangaili and the Jiralhani, as for the first time the Sangaili were directly threatened in terms of physical strength. But the division between the Ungoi and the Kigyar, and that of the Sangaili and Jiralhani, were not the only divisions within the Covenant, merely the most visible, Jin slyly revealed. In fact, the most dangerous division was one that the Covenant as a whole refused to acknowledge: the growing divide between the Sangaili and the Sanchum. You see, while the prophets did intend to fulfill their end of the writ of union and lead the Covenant on the great journey, they quickly became addicted to more earthly pleasures. Jin explained as she showed the prophets in their current state, reduced to floating around in gravity chairs or rings wrapped around their waists. Only a fraction could still find the strength to walk on their own feet. With the Sangaili protecting them and enforcing their will, they were unquestionably the masters of all Covenant space, able to enjoy its vast riches to their heart's content. But they weren't satisfied with that. They wanted more wealth, more luxury, more power, and many grew frustrated at having to share it all with the Sangaili, Jin clarified. What's more, the Sangaili had proven to be anything but obedient enforcers. They earnestly viewed themselves as equals to the Sanchum within the Covenant. And while they respected and followed the Sanchum's lead in most things, they were more than willing to push back and make their own decisions. More importantly, they weren't afraid to ask questions that would threaten the Sanchum's grip on power. It was not long before the Sanchum began searching for a replacement, a new species that would protect them without bothering to think for themselves. "Oh, I see where this is going," Adler remarked with a conspiratorial grin as Jin showed the Covenant finding and integrating the brutes into their ranks, with the prophets elevating the brutes to the caste right beneath the Sangaili and giving them unprecedented control over their own vessels, armies, and fleets, much to the Sangaili's protest. One prophet in particular, who was elaborately dressed and in an ornately decorated gravity chair, was overseeing the armament personally. Ashbin figured this must have been one of the Covenant hierarchs. Then, at the twilight of the 23rd Age of Doubt, 3 prophets began a power play. Jin revealed as she showed the prophet from earlier, now wearing simpler clothing, conspiratorially meeting with another. Ord Casto, then the Minister of Fortitude, and Lodmaron, then the Vice Minister of Tranquility, had discovered what appeared to be a massive trove of Forerunner artifacts on a new world, more than any other in their history. Believing that recovering these artifacts would ensure their ascension to becoming hierarchs of the Covenant, and wanting to recover these artifacts for the Sanchum alone, Fortitude had Tranquility order a Jiralhani ship to verify what their luminary was telling them. This world was Harvest. Rather than show the first battle of Harvest, Jin kept their attention focused on High Charity, where she explained, as the brutes ransacked Harvest, to ensure their play for power would succeed, the Minister of Fortitude blackmailed the Prophet of Restraint into resigning, under the threat that he would publicly reveal that the hierarch had illegitimately fathered 2 children despite being forbidden to reproduce at all. But they needed a third to ensure their coup would succeed, and so they turned to the philologist RWBY, leader of a group of ascetic priests who tended to the anodyne spirit and its oracle, the Forerunner in Salem known as mendicant bias. It was here that the truth and the lie that formed the heart of Covenant society was laid bare. For eons I have watched, mendicant bias revealed. Listen to you misinterpret. This is not reclamation. It was then that the ship briefly tried to ignite, only to short-circuit as a cluster of charred lecolo worms operating its interior fell out. All three prophets looked at mendicant bias' inactive body in absolute shock and horror before slowly looking at each other. All three prophets immediately understood what the oracle had revealed, or at least its implications. It not only undermined the concept of the Great Journey, it completely rebuked it, exposing it as the mistranslation and lie it was. Jin revealed as a sinking feeling started to grow in Ashbin's gut. They did not know whether the humans, the reclaimers the oracle had spoken of, were merely the descendants of the Forerunners, their chosen heirs, or Forerunners themselves. It didn't matter. They all knew that, regardless of the truth of humanity's inheritance, all of Covenant society was built around the concept of the Great Journey. Humanity was proof that it was false, that either it had not happened at all, or that even the gods could be left behind. Additionally, the presence of potential living gods threatened the Sanchom's hold on power they would rather die than relinquish. Oh, those motherfuckers, Crow hissed, speaking for all of them as Ashbin felt an intense, fiery rage build up inside him. And so, to preserve the Covenant and their power, the newly crowned prophets of truth, mercy, and regret launched the ninth age of reclamation and declared humanity's mere existence to be an affront to their gods, marking them for annihilation. Jin showed the Covenant fleet embark towards human space, kicking off the Human Covenant War. He didn't care about that. None of them did. Instead, every single adult in the room was glaring daggers at the three hierarchs who ordered it. Iapin already despised them simply because billions had died on their orders. But in a twisted way, he would have thought better of them if they had been motivated by genuine religious beliefs. Now it was clear. The only reason why they started this terrible war, a war that threatened to wipe out all of humanity and had already killed billions of people, was because they wanted to keep their power. It sickened Ashbin, it disgusted him, it infuriated him. "I want them dead," Hood darkly declared, his cap casting an intense shadow over his eyes. "I don't care how, but I want them dead." "Already working on it," Adler growled, showing the most emotion since their time with Jin began. Initially, the Covenant believed that their war against humanity would be quick and simple, much as it had with every other species they came across, Jin explained. But humanity proved to be far more tenacious and numerous than they anticipated. Humanity's technology may have been completely outclassed by the Covenants, but their tactics were often superior and their soldiers better trained. What's more, the Covenant quickly grew to fear humanity's demons, the Spartans, who were reassigned to fight the Covenant instead of the insurrection they were trained to subdue. The war dragged on, and the War of Annihilation quickly became the costliest conflict the Covenant had ever waged since the War of Beginnings. Ashbin saw Lord Hood smirk proudly at that proclamation, but otherwise said nothing as Jin continued. To prevent the Sanghaili and the rest of Covenant society from looking too closely into the war and its true cause, the hierarchs took personal control over the conflict. They elevated the Ministry of Resolution to its present state, deployed younger, inexperienced commanders and warriors who would be less likely to ask questions in pursuit of honor and glory, and put their thumbs on the scales to mask the losses the Covenant were experiencing. When questions were inevitably asked, the prophets would use their left hands, the silent shadow, and the even more secretive prelates, to silence them. But humanity still refused to roll over and die despite the odds stacked against them. What's more, not even the prophets themselves were unified in their goals, Jin revealed. The prophet of truth is not content with sharing power with mercy and regret. He desires to be the sole leader of the Covenant. What's more, he is the leader of an influential faction of Sanchom who wants to replace the Sanghaili with the Jiralhani. Mercy is too preoccupied with religious affairs. After all, he was only brought in as their third member because he was in the right place at the right time. In most matters, he simply deferred to truth. Regret, meanwhile, is fond of the Sanghaili and would not entertain any thought of replacing them with the Jiralhani. He often embarked on his own plans that ran counter to truths, sometimes in direct opposition. Jin showed a massive cluster of asteroids grouped together by various cables. Ashbin recognized it as the RWBY, an asteroid base used by insurrectionists in the 23 Lib-Ray system as a pirate base before being destroyed in the mid-2530s. As Truth ordered a Jackal pirate to infiltrate the insurrectionist base and start an illicit trade network with them, with the ultimate goal of obtaining the location of Earth and other human colonies. Regret simultaneously declared those Jackals heretics and ordered a team of elite zealots to eliminate them. Ultimately, their plans collided with each other, resulting in the rebels' destruction and the elimination of the data truth so desperately desired. Part of Ashbin thought that was ironic and somewhat humorous, but the rest was beginning to see where Jin was going with this. Beyond that, the Covenant itself is remarkably inefficient. Jin pointed out as she showed the Covenant reverse engineering foreign artifacts, including a suppressor from which they derived both the plasma rifle and plasma pistol. They do not fully understand the true capabilities of their own technology. Innovation is discouraged in favor of imitation. For to suggest improvements in a holy design is to imply that one can do better than their gods. This mindset permeates across their entire empire. The Sangheili may be capable warriors, but most refuse to employ anything but time-tested and archaic tactics that are carried by their technological supremacy. Only a few know better. Jin showed one elite fleet master wearing golden armor, standing on the bridge of his warship as it burned a human world to the ground. His back was turned, but Ashbin recognized the elite as the same zealot who had led Regret's task force into the rubble. Adler definitely recognized the Sangheili, and he muttered, "That's Thel Vedami, fleet master of the fleet of particular justice, and top of ONI's hit list." Ashbin grunted in acknowledgement as more worlds were destroyed under Thel's guiding hand, killing billions. Jin continued, "What's more, Covenant society is divided into hundreds of separate ministries. They're constantly plagued by civil strife as these ministries compete for power and resources, often resulting in open warfare. New heretic uprisings begin almost every day across their vast empire. Most are small, while others can claim entire worlds. Indeed, the majority of the Covenant military is reserved for fighting themselves in their near, ever-present civil wars." The scene shifted to another Sangheili, this one an absolute giant. Standing over 11 feet tall and dressed in an ornately decorated silver and gold armor, with a purple cape flowing behind him. Jin explained, "This is Zaitan Jar Wadanri, Imperial Admiral of the Covenant, the highest rank in their entire military. If the prophets so desired, they could have ordered Zaitan to take command of the entire Covenant Navy and destroy humanity before they even had a chance to retaliate. But he was too powerful, too influential, and too respected. Giving him victory over the humans he, too, despised would have elevated his status even higher, and so out of fear they relegated their most capable officer and his fleet of joyous exultation to the borders of Covenant space, away from humanity and further glory. It was an exile in all but name, which he recognized all too readily." Jin continued her explanations, going into more detail on the various cracks in the Covenant's foundation. Important individuals were highlighted, conflicts exposed and elaborated upon, and more. Even the Covenant's language was revealed, all recorded in a Halsey's device to be disseminated across the UNSC. With each scene shown, with each word spoken, Jin painted a picture that even someone as drunk as Crow could understand plainly. They were the ingredients to victory. "So you see, Spartan, that humanity cannot defeat the Covenant on the battlefield," Jin declared as she finished spinning her tale. "But if you play your cards right, and push in just the right directions, you can help the Covenant destroy themselves." Everyone stared at Jin, and wide smiles began to grow across their faces, especially Adler's. Ashbin got the sense that the ONI agent was especially pleased with Jin's answer, and it wasn't hard to understand why. ONI was an organization of spies, and they suddenly got the green light that covert operations, subterfuge, sabotage, and fomenting dissent in an enemy was perhaps the only way they were going to survive as a species. It was basically handing someone a near-divine vindication. It may not have been as definitive of an answer as Ashbin would have liked, but it offered something invaluable. It offered them a chance. "Thank you," John said, and Jin smiled warmly before stealing her gaze. "One more thing, Spartan," Jin added as the scene began to shift again. "If you want to ensure humanity's survival, take heed. The Covenant cannot find Halo." Ashbin raised an eyebrow. Then his jaw dropped as Jin revealed Halo. It was a massive ring world, orbiting between a reddish-brown gas giant and a large rocky moon. The exterior of the Halo was covered in an elaborate maze of Forerunner glyphs, lights, and architecture. But the interior of the Halo truly caught their attention. It was a verdant, Earth-like environment. Temperate rainforests, arid deserts, vast mountain ranges, wide plains, frozen tundra. It was absolutely beautiful. Then Ashbin remembered why Jin was showing them this. He didn't know what Halo was, but it was clearly dangerous underneath its visage. Was it a weapon of some kind? Perhaps one fielded by the Forerunners against whatever foe that destroyed them? But then, if it was a weapon, why would they make it support life? It was very odd and perplexing, and Ashbin didn't have an answer for it. "What is Halo?" John asked in concern, and Jin merely smiled. "That is a story for another time," Jin answered, then returned to her lamp. Tilda, with both questions exhausted, Everyone exited Haven's vault, leaving the lamp behind. Alder offered to take it off-world for safekeeping, but Ashbin refused. He was willing to trust the UNSC enough to use the questions, but he wasn't going to let them take any of the relics off-world. That was something the rest of his inner circle, even with their current friction, agreed with wholeheartedly. After that, they went their separate ways. Ashbin had stayed with Spring, trying to comfort her after the poor girl had witnessed so many things that she never should have been privy to. Some cookies and ice cream had calmed her down somewhat, but he didn't think that would be enough. He'd spend more time with her, but his responsibilities regretfully meant he couldn't devote much. Eventually, her handler-turned adoptive mother returned to pick her up, and Spring politely bid Ashbin farewell. As he watched the family depart, Ashbin's heart wept for the girl. She didn't deserve any of this. None of them did. But, sadly, that was life, and they had to make the best of it. At the very least, as Ashbin got onto his personal bullhead and started the long flight back to Beacon, he was content with the idea that while the odds were certainly stacked against them, they had a chance to actually win. That was a luxury he hadn't had in a long, long time, and he was more than eager to firmly grasp the opportunity and wring it for all it was worth. Tilda, at the bottom of Remnant's deepest, darkest ocean, foul beasts swam between the crevices. Pressures that would destroy anything on the surface were utterly inconsequential to them. The surface might as well be another planet to them. Dotted along the seabed were hydrothermal vents surrounded by clams, tube worms, bacteria, and more, all adapted to the harsh temperatures and pressures. Fish swam through the darkness by using bioluminescence to see, while others didn't have eyes at all. Then, as with all other places on Remnant, there were Grimm. Most people had never seen these species of Grimm. After all, they hardly ever went up to the surface. When they did, they were often the stuff of nightmares. Swimming among the undersea Grimm was a massive beast, perhaps the largest Grimm on the entire planet. It was a gargantuan whale, a leviathan infamous across the world and known by the name Monstra. Its legend had terrified sailors in coastal settlements across Remnant for thousands of years and had dwelled within its folklore for just as long. One of Remnant's constellations was even named after the monster. It was here, nestled deep inside Monstra, where Salem now resided. It appears that the UNSC found Castle Evernight. Hazel reported as he joined Salem in what approximated a bridge inside Monstra's skull. He couldn't see anything outside the window, but that didn't matter at the moment. They reduced it to rubble, then sent teams in. As we expected, Salem remarked, her back turned to Hazel. I hope they enjoyed the gift I left behind for them, especially after I spent so much effort making sure it would survive long enough for them to reclaim it. Hazel nodded. He and Salem had left behind their old headquarters months ago, not long after the UNSC started building a more permanent presence on their planet. As his mistress reasoned, while the kingdoms of Remnant had been unable to brave deeply enough into the wastes of Torvis to find their base of operations, much less fight past all the Grimm to simply get there, the UNSC did not have that problem. They controlled space, and from space they could see almost anywhere on the planet. It was only a matter of time before they found Castle Evernight, and so they packed their bags, or rather Hazel packed his, and they evacuated into Monstra. They'd been swimming on the bottom of the ocean for months, with only the occasional surfacing to allow Hazel to get out and gather more supplies or information, often both. The bridge filled with silence once again, and Hazel looked at the back of Salem's head. Although she couldn't see him, she seemed to notice his unease and ordered, "Speak your mind, Hazel." Hazel cleared his throat, then replied, "Salem, I must admit that I failed to see the logic here." "Elaborate," Salem calmly requested as she turned around, giving him a look that reminded Hazel of a mother humoring a confused child. "Lionheart gave us the information about the Covenant to try to earn a truce." Hazel started listing. "Instead, we released it onto the CCT network through the RLA and kicked off a Grimtide." "Indeed," Salem replied. "I must admit, while it didn't go exactly as I would have liked, I'm still satisfied with the results." "Which is where I'm getting confused," Hazel admitted. "From where I'm standing, the Grimtide failed. In fact, I would say we're in a worse position now than we were before. We were hoping the Grimtide would break Remnant's alliance with the UNSC before it could get off the ground. Instead, the alliance got stronger, we've lost countless Grimm that will take time to repopulate and grow, and the UNSC knows of our existence. At the very least, they strongly suspect it. With all of this, I would argue we shouldn't have launched the Grimtide at all." Salem was silent for a moment, but rather than get angry, she simply smiled in amusement before saying, "I see why you may think that, Hazel, and our primary goal of breaking the Earth-Remnant alliance did fail. But I believe you are thinking too narrowly, too short-term to fully understand our position." "And that would be?" Hazel asked, and Salem's smile grew. "You speak of the UNSC finding out about us as a bad thing, something to be avoided at all costs," Salem said. "On the contrary, as soon as they arrived in orbit, It was only a matter of time before they discovered our presence. Either they would have found us on their own, or Ashbin would have told them after a few years of dawdling. Either way, there's no point in trying to hide from them. Not anymore. That's why we moved into Monstra. Then, she continued, there's the nature of the UNSC themselves. They've been on Remnant for almost a year now, and until this point, we never truly gained an understanding of just how powerful they are. The Grimtide afforded us a perfect opportunity to see the UNSC bring everything they had against us. Now we not only know what the UNSC is capable of, we also know what lines they are unwilling to cross, their limitations. That information is invaluable. Yes, but I would argue only a single event isn't enough to fully determine that. Hazel refuted, and Salem nodded in agreement. True, but this was still a crucial test that needed to be done, Salem pointed out. In fact, this was the only chance we would have gotten to launch the Grimtide in the first place. The UNSC aren't like General Ironwood and his little army. They're proactive, but in a much more methodical, Ashbin-like way, able to look at both the big and small pictures, then react accordingly. That makes them dangerous, especially since they not only recognized the threat of a mass panic, but they took steps to try to reduce the risk well in advance. Ironwood, in comparison, would have simply recalled all of his forces to Atlas, leaving the rest of Remnant out to dry as they faced the full brunt of the Grimtide, then swoop in afterwards as the conquering hero. Instead, the UNSC have been thinning Grim hordes and hunting alphas for months all across Remnant, while building up their defenses, bringing in more troops, and fortifying each kingdom as much as they possibly could while strengthening their relationship with Remnant's people. Even Menagerie was fortified, something no other kingdom would have bothered with simply because it's the home of the Faunus. In fact, that the UNSC clearly recognizes Remnant's racial fault lines and are acting to reduce them by propping the Faunus up reinforces my point. If we waited longer, Hazel, even by a few months, the Grimtide wouldn't be nearly as strong as it would have been, and the RLA's words would have fallen on deaf ears, dismissed as rampant paranoia by conspiracy theorists. We had to do this now, or we'd lose the chance forever. Then, Salem began with a wide smile. There's the long-term implications that the Grimtide has now set into motion. Ashbin didn't tell the UNSC about us prior to this. Same with the relics and the maidens. Most likely, all this time, they have been working under the same impression that the rest of Remnant does, that the Grim are leaderless. Unlike the kingdoms, however, the UNSC isn't accustomed to that fact and are in a position to accept the truth much more readily than the kingdoms are. They're going to discover that they were lied to because of this Grimtide. They probably already have, and they're not going to be happy, especially since so many of their soldiers died defending the kingdoms. This was my true goal, Hazel, Salem declared. By exposing Ashbin's lies to an increasingly desperate UNSC, I've laid the foundation for future conflict. They may come to decide that they can no longer trust Ashbin nor Remnant's leadership to give them the dust and huntsmen they need to save their people from the Covenant. When people are desperate to survive, they're willing to do whatever it takes regardless of whom it hurts. Their relationship will begin to break down, eventually culminating in the UNSC outright invading Remnant after being ousted. As they destroy each other, we can simply walk in and obtain what is ours, our enemies too exhausted to resist. But what if that doesn't happen? Hazel pointed out, and Salem simply shook her head. Even if Ashbin does the smart thing and tells them about me, about the relics, and about the maidens, we've still set the stage for future conflict, Salem said. We revealed the truth about the Covenant to Remnant's people. They may buy into their propaganda now and dismiss the truth, but will they continue to do so after their husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, and friends go off to fight an alien war and never return? Or perhaps they do return, but with broken minds, bodies, and horrific stories of unfathomable death and glassed worlds? Many are going to look back at what the RLA claimed and start to believe that they were right. That this wasn't their war, that the UNSC are using them, their people are paying the price, and that the UNSC's intentions towards Remnant are not peaceful coexistence. When that happens, Hazel, they will pick up where the RLA left off and fight back against their oppressor, and perhaps even reach out to outside groups with similar grievances. Hazel's eyes widened, and he realized, you intend to bring the insurrection here. Yes, Salem confirmed, and we won't have to lift a finger. As they destroy themselves, as humans tend to do, we can stay here, watching, observing, planning, even interfering on occasion to suit our ends and goals. Meanwhile, we can focus on what comes next. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded in acceptance before asking, and what has come next? Salem smiled, then declared, I want to know everything we can learn about the Covenant, Hazel. And I mean everything. Salem turned around to look into the impenetrable darkness beyond Monstra's window. Hazel merely nodded in acquiescence before turning to his quarters. She didn't shift as he left, instead keeping her attention forward. At the same time, as the valve door sealed shut with an organic hiss, Salem smiled and thought back to a conversation she once had so long ago. Looks like I was right, Osma, Salem smugly thought to herself. Once again, you were wrong, and I can't wait to watch you burn.